A lightning-fast blow from her right fist came rocketing in, so fast that Jonathan had to use stamina redirection to counter it. He was propelled to the side, the sonic boom barely phasing him at this point. It was likely something that he would get used to over time. The woman withdrew her fist and stared at Jonathan. "What manner of creature are you? You looked as if you had been flayed, and then left out in the wastes to dry." "I'm not from here," Jonathan replied. "I have a proposition for you though." Before he could elaborate, the woman came in for another strike. He could tell that she was built for speed, unlike the other Uthraki leaders had been. Husher had been much more physically powerful, boosted by his larger body. However, this one leaned into her natural size in order to boost her speed. "You come into my village, attack my guards, and then demand an audience?" "I think not." The Uthraki sped up, starting to use a skill. With a sigh, Jonathan realized that this had already escalated. Still, there was no reason not to share his plan as he fought. As a fist whistled his way, coated in black flames, he met it with a blast of purple light. The sheer speed of his opponent was shown by the fact that his fist had only covered a quarter of the distance between them as he went. The two attacks fought for supremacy in the air, but Jonathan eventually got the better of his opponent. Although she was far higher level than him, most of her stat points had evidently gone into dexterity, as he was still physically stronger. "I seek to defeat Granath," Jonathan said in the brief lull. "Will you help me? I understand that your people have a grudge against him." The woman looked conflicted for a moment, but then shook her head, continuing to fight. Jonathan gritted his teeth in annoyance, and kept going. The fight was more of an exchange of blows than anything else, seeing as Jonathan was too durable to take much damage, and the woman was fast enough to avoid his strikes. However, he still had some abilities in reserve. Eventually, he used one. Flaring his divinity into his gauntlets, he drew the attention of his opponent with his rune of beckoning. It was only for the briefest of moments, but it was enough for him to land a telling blow. His fist slammed into her cheek, cracking the bone and sending the woman flying into a nearby wall. "Will you listen to me now?" Jonathan called out. Instead of a reply, he only heard a growl. A blaze of blood-red light erupted from the swirling dust of the Uthraki's landing spot, and a moment later a hulking figure emerged. With grotesquely enlarged features, and twisted horns, it looked like a demonic herald, sent to punish the damned. With a howl of bestial fury, the beast raced towards Jonathan. Despite its new form, it seemed to retain much of its previous speed. This was no doubt why the battle had seemed too easy before. Jonathan had expected more from an opponent at least 50 levels higher than his own. The woman came hurtling in, her fists igniting the air around them. Jonathan shot to the side, his stamina redirection ability barely saving him. The fist snapped out and grabbed his foot a moment later, tugging him out of the air. With a whoosh, he was propelled upwards, flying into the sky. Below him, the Uthraki gathered power within her hands, preparing some sort of energy blast. Jonathan gathered his own energy as he began to fall, sending a pulse of the void down towards his opponent. A spear of crimson light raced up to meet it, and the two attacks exploded in midair, buffeting both fighters with a wave of wind. Jonathan started to fall a moment later, readying his divinity for a powerful strike. Elemental energy layered on top of his mana, with his divinity growing underneath. With a battle cry, he flipped midair, making sure that his fist fell first. As he plummeted from the sky, trailers of power gathered around his form, allowing him to gather more and more energy from around himself. With a hiss, the complete nothingness of his hungering decay skill entered the world, eating away at the matter in its way. The hulking monstrosity that the Uthraki leader had become growled at him, raising its own fist to strike. That would prove to be a mistake. Jonathan landed a moment later, only to be caught by a sudden kick. It blasted through his guard and into his chest, shattering ribs and crushing organs. He shouted in pain and only managed to curl up into a ball to protect himself at the last moment. He bounced across the ground like a skipping stone, hurtling through a nearby hut. A few Uthraki were inside, and they seemed perplexed at his presence. Perhaps the sound of battle was so common in these parts that the inhabitants of this village had seen the fight as simply being par for the course. Golden divinity spread throughout his limbs, filling him with power. He dodged the incoming blow, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and smashed a fully enhanced fist into the Uthraki's gut. There was a flare of light, and the woman suddenly had a hole in her abdomen. Jonathan withdrew his fist and struck again. Transformation skills like the one the Uthraki was using usually had a time limit. He only had to outlast it. Then again, his smite skill was similar in nature. However, he had long since outgrown its most severe drawbacks, but had also outgrown some of its benefits as well. Upon first coming to this world, the skill had increased his power many times over. Now, even with his increased divinity pool, he was lucky if it increased it by even a half. It would be time for him to start upgrading his skills soon enough. Jonathan exchanged blows with his enemy for the next few minutes, trying to outlast the woman's blows. However, she seemed to grow stronger and stronger as the battle progressed, drawing energy from her injuries. Soon, even with smite, Jonathan was unable to keep up. As one devastating uppercut whipped his head back, almost breaking his spine, he realized that it was time to cut his losses and go. Pretending to charge up an attack, he instead ran for it, darting away from the village. Behind him, there was a roar of rage as the Uthraki leader saw what he was doing. However, he had enough of a head start to get out in time. A few minutes later, he was legging it across the cave floor, hearing the terrifying noise of pursuit coming from behind him. His chest was on fire, every step sending shooting stars of pain up and down his body. However, he had dealt with worse. The Uthraki was still chasing him, but he could tell that she was flagging. Without conflict, whatever skill she was using was being weakened over time. Eventually, the noises faded away, and Jonathan was left on his own, running across the ash. As smite ran out, he collapsed, gasping for air. He lay there on the ground for a few minutes, trying to gather his energy. His body slowly twisted itself back together in that time, allowing him to rise once more. That had not gone the way that he had intended. His hubris would be the end of him if he did not keep it in check. Although most fights in his past had gone his way, it was important to remember that there were always those stronger than oneself. Even in this realm, there were beings too strong for him to fight. This all framed Granath's might even more effectively than before. If he had been able to make this realm his plaything, then what would he do to Jonathan? Granath was able to keep his strength at its normal level within his city, which meant that there was no way for Jonathan to even the odds. He would either have to shape up, or die. As he slowly recovered, he started to search for another village. He was not going to leave this place until he had found what he was looking for. Because of Husher, he knew that it was possible. Back in the ash heaps, the armies of Granath swept across the land like a black tide, leaving flattened earth and a litany of corpses in their wake. As they neared the rim, they grew closer and closer to Jonathan's citadel. A black fervor roiled within their minds, the desire to serve their master and kill his enemies. Most of the Dread Legions had been indoctrinated since joining, and only the Tier 2s had any sort of real autonomy. Bound by oaths of magic and the system, they were unable to betray their master. The world seemed to shake as they passed, the footsteps of such an army creating a localized earthquake in their wake. Jonathan Harlow had committed a grave offense against Granath by simply existing, and it was their job to excise it. Otherwise, they would have failed. The only thing worse than death for people like the soldiers of Granath was being unable to properly serve their lord. In the faction headquarters, an emergency meeting had been summoned in the city hall, on the matter of the newest addition to the city's stock of Tier 2s. Although Edgar and Eva had been mollified by their encounter with Husher, to everyone else, he was simply a wild brute that would kill them all at the first chance that he got. Even worse, there was no way to stop him. We need to expel that monster from the city at this very moment. One of the counselors screamed, her voice twisted by rage and ignorant fear. How will we be able to fight a war on both fronts? If you could just put your xenophobic fervor aside for one moment, Grange began, before being cut off by a storm of dissent. Little was getting done here, because of the toxic environment. Eventually, Edgar decided to act. A sudden tempest rose up in the room, fluttering the hair of those present. Edgar rose out of his chair on wings of wind, his form surrounded by a hurricane of arcane power. Enough! He roared, empowering his voice with his element. This only serves to weaken our cause. Have any of you even considered meeting with the object of your bile? The counselors were cowed, but not for long. The egos of politicians were too secure to be easily quashed, even by overwhelming force. You are just a dog of your master, the woman who had spoken earlier spat. Whatever that man says, you jump to it. We all know he has another agenda that he is working on the side. Edgar turned his baleful gaze towards his detractor, and the woman gulped. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of the world on her. Are you purposefully obtuse, or just plain stupid? Edgar asked, his voice back to normal. Why would Jonathan leave a council here if his purpose was to rule the city with an iron fist? You people are simply pathetic. Whatever your class is, it should be replaced with one called professional victim. That caused a gale of laughter from Grange and Eva, and a muffled response from the woman it had been addressed to. Edgar haughtily ignored it, and sat back down. His dark gaze reminded everyone just who was in charge here. As Edgar was saying, we should stage a meeting with this husher, Grange said. This time there were no disputes. Anyone who spoke up against this would make it clear that they had an agenda, one that worked against the interests of the city. At that point, they would be removed. With war coming, treachery would not be tolerated. The councillors rose as one, heading out of the city hall and towards the walls. It was time for them to see what their new ally was made of. As this political intrigue unfolded in his city, Jonathan scoured the plain of Tartarus for more allies to bring into his fold. Now that he knew the strengths of the Uthraki leaders, judging by the size of their village, he only sought out those that were about the same size as Hushers had been. Even then, those were hard to find. It took him over 2 hours of searching to even find one, which had required him to backtrack. It seemed that he had been heading deeper into Tartarus on his sojourn, heading towards the heart of the realm. There dwelt beings far too powerful for him to defeat, at least for now. Creatures at the peak of Tier 2 likely lived there, probably not as powerful as Granath, but close to that level. One day he would challenge them, but not now. He had more pressing concerns, such as the army marching towards his home. Dreams of power could wait for now. He slowly made his way towards the village that he had spotted, keeping an eye out for any monsters. He did not want to draw the attention of the villagers by staging a massive brawl outside of their village. So far, he had made a few observations about the Uthraki culture. They seemed to treat duels as being sacred, especially with their chieftains. When he had fought with Husher, and the unnamed woman in the last village, none of the guards had interfered, despite the fact that they would have likely been able to defeat Jonathan if they did so. The Uthraki were an insular society, and their only contact with the outside world in eons had been with Granath. This world was more like a dungeon than anything else. Rather than being a fully independent realm, it seemed to be governed by the system somewhat. The Uthraki were more like sapient dungeon monsters than anything else. That was likely the explanation for why there were no children. Although Husher had told him that he was the son of another Uthraki, there was clearly something else going on here. The system probably respawned the Uthraki when they died. However, that raised questions about what would happen if they left Tartarus, like Husher had. Such a thing had likely never happened before. Would that mean that the Uthraki would be able to have children in the outer world? That raised interesting questions, both ethical and philosophical. Then Jonathan remembered that he was not here for some quest of justice. He was here to break the hells. Morality could wait for now. He would likely have to commit atrocities on his path to the top. Indeed, he already had. How many people had died in his escape from the Ashen Citadel? Sure, it was Granath's magic that had done the damage, but it had still been Jonathan's fault. With an iron will, he forced the thoughts deep down inside himself, replacing them with steely concentration. He had a mission to complete. He snuck into the village like a wraith, moving past the guards without drawing their attention. There was no wall around this village, and it was less guarded than the last one. There were fewer people as well, and the leader's hut was a simple one-story building. Jonathan reached it in a matter of minutes, and peered in one of the open windows, making sure to create as small a cross-section as possible. The perceptions of Tier 2s were superhuman after all. In any case, the window was more of a hole in the wall. In a realm as hot as this, people needed as much ventilation as possible. A hulking brute, built along the lines of Husher, sat at a small table, sharpening a weapon. It looked like a broadsword, but it had a curiously curved tip, almost like a saber. In the hands of the titan that wielded it, however, it seemed like it would be able to do a lot of damage. As Jonathan watched the man, however, he realized that the resemblance to Husher was more than just superficial. They had the same facial features. It seemed that this man was a family member of Husher's. Which was curious, given that the man had only mentioned his father. While there were no children born in this world, they still had to have come from somewhere. Everyone had originally possessed a father and a mother, and family ties continued even here. He could use this to his advantage, if he did this right. Jonathan slunk in through the window, landing next to the Uthraki. The man whipped his head up, and had his sword in his hand in the blink of an eye. Jonathan raised his hands in placation, trying to prevent the bestial Uthraki from attacking him on sight. "I mean you no harm. Are you a relative of Husher?" The Uthraki froze, and got to his feet, with a grimace on his face. "How do you know that name, outsider?" he said, looking extremely suspicious. Jonathan noticed that he was slowly edging towards him. With a slight shift of his legs, he got into a more battle-ready stance. "He is one of my allies." "Ha! As if the proud Husher would bind his fate to a weakling like you. I do not believe you, liar." He spoke bitterly, as if he disliked the other man intensely. "I offered him a chance to get revenge on Granath. Does that not interest you?" Jonathan asked. "You mean to say that you will take me to the outside world?" the Uthraki asked, with an inscrutable look on his face. "Yes. I will grant you a boon that will let you retain your strength in the low mana environment. Does that sound acceptable? You seek to placate me with these honeyed words, but you are merely another tool of Granath. Did he finally run out of breeding stock?" "Breeding stock?" Jonathan asked, confused. "If you come from the outside world, then you must have seen the half-breed Uthraki there. Granath stole many of our people away to serve as studs and broodmares for his ambitions. Our race is naturally resilient and strong, and he wanted to harness our power for himself." Jonathan took in the new information with a slight rise of an eyebrow. That certainly explained a lot. It seemed that Husher had not been the first Uthraki to leave Tartarus after all. While a lot of the races in the ash heaps were familiar to him, the presence of actual demons had seemed a bit on the nose. Instead, it seemed that the Uthraki were the original progenitors of the race that he had seen. "I assure you, Jonathan began, before the sword whistled towards his head. He let his legs collapse, falling beneath the path of the sword. It seemed that this would end in violence after all. He surged upwards, one fist crackling with energy. He really needed to find a way to bind all of his various skills together, and create a more cohesive attack. Perhaps he could gain another mythical skill. His fist rocketed up like a missile, slamming into the Uthraki's chin. The man staggered backwards, and Jonathan moved in, sending a barrage of punches into his torso. With a roar, the other fighter seized at the air, and the house around him started to warp. With a cracking noise, the stone rushed inwards, coating Jonathan in a layer of rock. He could feel the Uthraki's will and elemental energy trying to crush him into oblivion. In response, Jonathan flared his void energy, sending a cloud of purple light out in all directions. With his natural strength, he flexed his muscles, shattering the stone. However, he was met with a stab from the sword, straight into a gap in his armor. The weapon slid in, puncturing his skin with ease. A cold feeling radiated from the wound, and Jonathan heard a laugh echo from the Uthraki's mouth. He rushed back, pulling the sword out of himself, and staggered, clutching at the wound. "Did you base your estimation of me on my brother? He was always the weakest of us," the Uthraki said with a surprising bitterness. No wonder he had to resort to treachery to found his own village. Before Jonathan could process this, the Uthraki was off again, his sword starting to blaze with light. Jonathan cycled his stamina through his body, and began to center himself. It was time to begin the creation of the technique he had envisioned earlier. Normally, he simply threw his energy into his fist, creating a toxic mix of power that fought to break loose. However, he knew that he possessed more skill than that. First, his stamina rushed into his right arm, filling it with physical might. Next, concentrated mana coated his fist, creating a purple-tinged glow around it. Divinity rushed into his runes, sending a reddish light expanding outwards from the weapon. Finally, the colorless power of his hungering decay skill created a spike of nothingness that would serve to pierce the durable skin of his opponent. This combination was far more stable than before, and Jonathan smiled slightly. With a quick pulse of stamina to his legs, he was off, rocketing towards the Uthraki. The other man swung his sword to meet Jonathan's blow, but he twisted at the last moment, letting the weapon slam into the ground. Pivoting on his back leg, Jonathan drove his fist into the other man's stomach with all of his might. First, his void energy blasted a hole into the taut muscles. Next, his divinity widened the hole, weakening the flesh. Finally, his mana detonated, blasting a hole through the man's stomach. With a gurgling groan, the Uthraki staggered. Jonathan withdrew, wanting to negotiate, now that he was in a position of power. "Why do you not kill me?" The other man spat, holding one hand over his wound. "I would have killed you. Because, I need your help. I am not some soft, moral crusader that sees killing as wrong. Believe me, I would slay you in a heartbeat. However, there are few fighters of your caliber in the ash heaps that are allied to me. I need all the help I can get." "You are a fool, but a powerful one at that," the man said, with grudging respect. His wound was already starting to heal over, but the memory would linger for a while. "Very well. I am Tucker. However, you would do well to keep me away from my brother. I might not be able to control myself. More importantly, I expect to be returned to my village as soon as this is all over. My people will need my protection." Jonathan nodded, and moved over, remaining wary of a trick. However, Tucker did not move, instead waiting for Jonathan to confer the boon upon him. Like with Husher, Jonathan concealed his runic work with a series of misdirections, leading Tucker to believe that it was some sort of skill. Then he pulled out the token, and Tucker touched it. They both winked out of existence a moment later, appearing in the ash heaps. Tucker let out a gasp as he found himself standing under the light of the sun for the first time in his life. Although the sun was weakened by cloud cover, it was still something that would be shocking to the uninitiated. The man simply stared at it for a few minutes, before turning his gaze down towards the earth. The endless expanse of ash and rock, far colder than the plains of Tartarus, must have been a confusing sight to the man. He was used to lava flows and an oppressive heat. Here, it was still hot, at least by Jonathan's standards, but it was many times cooler than Tartarus. Being in Tartarus was like walking into an industrial oven. If not for his Tier 2 durability, Jonathan would have been cooked alive as soon as he entered the place. That was likely the reason behind the minimum level of the world. "How do you live in such a place?" Tucker asked. "It is like a barren wasteland," devoid of everything that makes life worth living. Well, it is a part of hell for a reason, Jonathan quipped. It wouldn't exactly be so if it was a nice place to live. As they spoke, Jonathan heard a noise from the small hut that Husher was making his residence, behind the initial wall that the man was building. Over the last few hours, it had increased in size, and now ringed the front side of the city. A large moat had been dug in front of the wall, and would serve as a deterrent to most Tier 1s. However, Tooker's eyes were drawn to the scene for a different reason. Husher walked out of the hut, not noticing his brother, and headed towards the wall. Before Jonathan could do anything, Tooker raced off, his face blazing with pure rage. Jonathan swore and ran after the enraged Uthraki, not sure exactly what had happened between the two brothers. Husher looked up a moment later, only managing to raise his fists in time to parry the incoming blow. By the looks of things, Tooker was trying to kill his brother. Jonathan shouted after the man, but he was lost in a bloody haze of rage. He reached Tooker a moment later, and bodily tore him off of his brother, throwing him to the ground. "Stop!" Jonathan roared, imbuing his voice with his aura. A cone of purple light exploded outwards, washing over Tooker, and seeming to take some of the edge off. Panting heavily, Tooker lay there, hatred blazing in his eyes. "Ask my dear brother why exactly I am this way," Tooker spat. Turning to Husher, Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "It was many years ago," Husher said, unwilling to elaborate more. However, Jonathan took a menacing step forwards, and the man continued. "My brother and I were weaker back then, trying to prove ourselves to our father. Both of us wanted a village of our own, but to do so, we would need to prove ourselves. One of the ways that our people traditionally do this is through a monster hunt. Taking a small war band with us, we tracked down a high-level beast. However, Tooker was weaker, and I was forced to intercede to save his dash." "You filthy liar!" Tooker screamed, getting to his feet. "You threw me aside so that you were guaranteed the last hit on the beast." Before Jonathan could react, Tooker thrust his sword towards his brother, imbuing it with energy. Husher raised a bulwark of stone in front of himself to block the blow, but it cracked apart under the force. With a groan of frustration, Jonathan grabbed the blade and pulled it away. There was a lot of familial drama here, and for everyone's interest, it was better for it to not end in bloodshed. Tooker growled, but let the sword go in the end, seeming content to glare at his brother. In the end, they were still family, and outside of bursts of uncontrollable rage, neither really wanted to kill the other. "This is a problem," Jonathan muttered. "Indeed," both of the other men said at the same time. "Why don't you two stay apart for now? You only have a few days to prepare for Granath's coming. Hatred of one another will only lead to our defeat." With a nod, Tooker headed away from his brother, making his way around the curve of the wall, to a place where he was out of sight. As soon as he was gone, Husher spoke. "Of all the people in Tartarus, you had to pick my brother. Either fate really hates you, or you simply are trying to sabotage yourself at heart." With that, Husher walked back into his hut, not wanting to speak anymore. Satisfied that the two brothers were not going to try and kill one another, at least for now, Jonathan headed into the city. As he walked through the gates, he noticed that there was a small commotion rising up from the city hall. No stranger to arrogant politicians and their fragile egos at this point, Jonathan headed towards it. Sometimes they needed a little bump in the right direction. He walked towards the building with purpose, ready to enforce his will upon the unruly bureaucrats. As he entered the building, however, he heard some familiar voices. "This city is not yours," one of the council members screamed, before seeming to cut off in fear. "You are a panoply of sorry fools," Edgar said. "Jonathan has done nothing but help this city. The presence of the Uthraki is nothing but a boon. How long until that filthy animal decided to attack us? You saw him. He is nothing but a beast," a female counselor exclaimed in fervent rage. Jonathan would have expected for there to be less racism in a world where there were so many species, but apparently not. There was little else to do but to intervene, it seemed. Jonathan strode into the city hall, cloaked in a mantle of his own power. As soon as he entered, the hubbub stopped, replaced by silence. Do not dare to discount Husher, simply for the purpose of your own bigoted agendas, Jonathan spat. He has already done far more for this city than you worthless parasites have done. I tolerated your presence because you know how to guide this city. Be sure that you do not outstay that welcome. Although Jonathan's voice was soft, it was filled with danger, and the counselors cringed. Only those who had not been involved in the overblown fear of Husher remained stalwart. Jonathan strode further into the room, sending his aura out in all directions. He felt somewhat guilty for doing this to people far weaker than he was, but he knew that a demonstration was necessary. Ever since this city was created, a sizable majority of your number have actively worked to undermine my will, and usurp me. Now, that strikes me as odd, given that you all live here at my pleasure. Normally, one would feel disposed to support my decisions, but at every turn, I find complaints here. I am no tyrant, but enough is enough. Jonathan headed off an ensuing tide of complaints with another pulse of aura. It is time for things to change around here. From now on, members of this council will be elected by the citizens. Until this happens, you are all out of a job. Jonathan stood there, waiting for the councilors to move. Alana and Grange did almost immediately, seeing the wisdom in Jonathan's words. Neither had any fear that they would not be re-elected. However, the others knew that their grasp on power was tenuous. Among the citizens, Jonathan was a revered figure. Anyone who stood against him would be unlikely to get any votes. One by one, the councilors trooped out of the building, leaving Jonathan with Edgar and Eva. He plopped down in a chair, tired of the politicking. Those fools needed to be shown their place, Eva said approvingly as she sat down by Edgar. Hopefully the city will take a different direction. You have been gone a lot, but many of the meetings here were nothing more than an open forum of complaint against you. People like those councilors only care about their own power. That needed to be done, but there will likely be repercussions from this, Jonathan replied. I doubt that they will rest quietly. As you said, they only care about power. What might they be tempted to do to gain it? For now, we have other things to worry about, Edgar reminded. We need to prepare for the invasion. Troublesome as the councilors can be, I doubt that they would resort to open treason. Who knows, Jonathan replied. However, you're right. I need to focus my energy on recruiting more Uthraki. I managed to get another one today. They really all seem to think alike. He neglected to tell them of the drama between the two Uthraki. It was not especially useful as of now. All that mattered was that there were two powerful fighters now added to the city's roster. With a deep sigh, Jonathan leaned back and closed his eyes. Although he had no need for sleep, he still needed to rest sometimes, in order to clear his mind. He meditated on the nature of his element for a few hours, managing to quell the rising tides of emotion within him. Being calm would serve his city far better than being in a fragile state. When it was time to fight, he needed to be at the top of his game. Edgar and Ava left eventually, leaving him in silence. Jonathan eventually rose from his meditation, and found himself alone. Getting up, he headed out of the city hall, and towards his cave. A bit of training, and perhaps some light reading, was in order. Upon reaching the cave, he had decided on his course of action. He needed to find out a bit more about the armies of the ash heaps, and he suspected that Patrolanus would have left a few useful tidbits of information within his diary. After all, he had fought against them himself. Jonathan found a comfortable spot to sit down, and pulled the book out of his storage device, getting ready to read. He flipped through it until he found a likely section. The Dread Legions. The forces of Granath are many in number, and steeped in cruelty. Known for their utter servitude to their master, and their power, they are Granath's agents in this world. When he is unable to quell unrest himself, they are sent in his stead. Led by many Tier 2s, they are a force to be reckoned with, especially in a world where the average level is so low. The core of the army is a platoon of Tier 2 fighters and mages that support the weaker members of the legions. Rank within the army is dictated by power. You must be a minimum of level 30 to join, and every 10 levels from there boosts you another rank. Tier 2s are at the pinnacle of this, and enjoy greater benefits than their weaker brethren. In our battles against them, we have found a highly disciplined force of soldiers who unquestionably follow orders. That is a dangerous combination. I do not know the state of the world when you are reading this, but the legions are still no doubt a terrifying force. Before defeating Granath, if such a thing is even possible, one must defeat the legions. Jonathan closed the book, not wanting this to deter him. There were a few more paragraphs, but most of the people mentioned in them were already dead. Out of everyone in the ash heaps, only Granath was immortal. Even a peak Tier 2 could only live for a few hundred years at most, depending on their stat distribution. In the time since the book had been written, the leaders of the army had probably changed many times, unless some of them had found some sort of way to prolong their lives. Granath obviously had some sort of secret to his immortality. Perhaps he had shared it with a select few of his lieutenants, or perhaps it was simply because he was a Circle Lord. The most important thing to remember about the ash heaps was that they were ancient. They had been here as long as the hells had been in existence, and the only thing that distracted from that was the relative weakness of the people there. This world had been here as long as the universe had been in existence. For the briefest of moments, Jonathan felt sorry for Granath. To live out eternity, stuck at one level of power forever was a sorry fate indeed. In this world, the only thing that would keep a person sane was the promise of future power. In the hells, however, that was not available. Then again, that was likely part of the nature of them. It was a place of punishment after all. Tiny morsels of power were offered, only to be ripped away within a few paltry years. In fact, that made it even worse than it would have been otherwise. Better to never have something than to have it and lose it. Jonathan trained for the rest of the day, alternating between his different pathway skills. Runecrafting was at a point of stagnation, as he lacked the insights necessary to create another array, or to find another rune. True Sight was as well, because looking at the same runes over and over again gave diminishing returns over time. However, his staples, mana manipulation and martial arts, were always available. In fact, he could practice them both at the same time. As he weaved around the cave, kicking and punching at a horde of unseen opponents, he sent tendrils of mana exploring the world around him, trying to manipulate them at the same time as his attacks. It was a lot harder than he would have thought, as he had to separate his consciousness into two different planes. Normally, multitasking with his high intelligence would have been a breeze, but when one of those tasks resided in the spiritual realm, while the other was in the physical, it was a lot harder. Still, he made some progress, enough to take him up a mastery rank in mana manipulation. Martial arts was still lagging a bit behind, as it had been the easier of the two skills to use. In any case, he had been training for over a dozen hours straight, and it was time for a break. He heard a commotion outside, prompting him to leave. He made his way out of the cave, only to find the city on high alert. Guards raced around, and people peered out of their windows, fearful of what was to come. Jonathan quickly saw what had caused this. Outside of the walls, a group of powerful monsters waited. They had made it this long without being attacked by such creatures, but their luck had run out. A pseudo-drake was flanked by a trio of Ashwalker golems, the strange alliance only possible because of the promise of the essence of the city dwellers. They were seemingly waiting for something, and eventually, the drake acted. Energy that had been coalescing in its mouth reached a crescendo, and a beam of molten energy erupted outwards, streaking towards the city. Mages on the walls started to layer shields and elemental abilities on top of one another, attempting to shield against the blow. Jonathan watched as he scrambled down the mountain. The city was in danger, and he was one of its strongest inhabitants. The beam hit home a few moments later, and the ground trembled. The shields held for a moment, but then started to crack one by one. Eventually, the beam made it through, but was extremely weakened. It crashed into the city center, taking out a few houses in the process. Jonathan gritted his teeth in rage and picked up the pace. A figure, wreathed in reddish light, sprang up from the ground outside the city, clutching a large axe. A moment later, another similar figure, this one with a sword, jumped as well. The two Uthraki were making their presence known. Husher reached the apex of his flight and then came down on the drake's head, slamming his axe down like a thunderbolt. Energy crackled around the blade, and the drake was flattened into the ground, unready for the strength of Husher. The man was uninhibited by the low mana density of this world, and as a result, he was using every one of his 170-odd levels to fight. In many ways, he was stronger than the monsters were. Meanwhile, Tucker took the fight to the golems, breaking off great chunks of their bodies with his attacks. It was a more gradual fight on his part, given the larger number of enemies, but he was still showing his worth. Jonathan sighed as he saw the damage that the monsters were already doing to the city and its environs. If this continued for much longer, it would drastically weaken their preparations for the oncoming siege. Filled with a sudden rage at these mindless beasts for attacking his city, Jonathan let out a roar of anger, flying across the city streets. He left blackened footmarks from the sheer speed of his passing. Edgar flew overhead on wings of wind, air swirling around him in a shadow of what was to come. Jonathan smiled at the sight of him, glad to see another powerful combatant join in on the defense. Behind him, Eva ran, using her spear to cover distance in a very unique manner. She planted the blunt end of her weapon in the ground, and used it like a spring, flipping through the air dozens of feet at a time. By this time, Jonathan was nearing the wall, and he started to channel energy into his fists. Stamina rushed to his legs, and he propelled himself over the stone wall of the city, the air whooshing around him at hurricane speeds. He traveled forwards over 100 feet, landing just behind Husher's barricade. The noise of battle was far louder out here, ranging from the stomping of gargantuan feet, to the roars of pain that the monsters let out. As of now, they were distracted by the two Uthraki, who were doing an admirable job of holding them off. Still, despite their higher level, it was hard to stop a being hundreds of times larger than oneself in a reasonable time frame as a melee fighter. Massive chunks of stone were missing from the Ashwalkers, and the drake was covered in wounds, but Husher and Tucker were running out of energy. The two Uthraki were clearly flagging, their movements starting to slow. Luckily for them, Jonathan had arrived. As soon as he landed, he leaped again, using even more of his stamina to travel. He shot forwards like a purple meteor, the flames of his element streaking around him like the tail of a comet. Mana surged to his fists as he traveled, and the caustic energy of the void created giant gauntlets of light around his hands. The pseudo-drake roared in defiance at the newcomer, before Jonathan made contact. Both fists slammed into the monster like hammers, sending shockwaves up and down his arms. However, the detonation of mana that soon followed was far more devastating to the monster. Its head rocked back as the explosion hit it, causing the beast to stagger. Husher took advantage of the distraction to send a razor-sharp arc of light up from his axe, straight through a chink in the beast's armor. There was a slicing noise, and a torrent of blood poured out from the wound. Husher let out a bellow of triumph, and raced towards the beast's leg. He had a strangely twisted arm, but the man seemed to be in his element, uncaring of his injuries. Jonathan chuckled, and got to work. He landed by the monster's feet, and rolled away as it stomped down. It was still trying to head towards the city, while fending off the combined attacks. Further afield, Edgar and Eva aided Tucker, taking down an Ashwalker in record time. Edgar eroded the stone with razor-sharp tornadoes of elemental energy, while Eva and Tucker used their weapons to break apart the stone. These monsters were not the insurmountable challenges that they had once seemed. Jonathan got to his feet as the leg passed, and summoned divinity to his right fist. Red light flared as his rune of hatred charged up, and he thrust it towards the beast's scaly leg. There was a blast of red energy, and scales shattered. With a small hole blasted in the skin, Jonathan was ready to get to work. Concentrated void energy in tainted mana swirled around his fist as he punched, creating a corona of light. His fist rocketed forwards, straight into the hole. The beast's hard skin hindered it this time, as it trapped the energy within its body. Skin bubbled and melted away as the inside of the creature's ankle was blasted apart at the seams by Jonathan's attack. The monster howled in pain, and stumbled forwards, unable to support its weight. Jonathan let it fall, watching as the previously majestic dragon-like creature fell to its knees in front of him. Husher let out a cry of delight and raced up its side, before sinking his axe into its neck. He withdrew the weapon a moment later, and swung once more, this time drawing upon his elemental mastery. A massive blade of obsidian, easily 30 feet in length, formed on the end of his axe. It came down with the force of a meteor, cutting deep into the monster's neck. Another strike made it so that the beast would never draw breath again. Essence entered Jonathan, almost enough to gain another level. Still, he had little to show for the last few days of training. All he had left for him were his unallocated stat points. Quickly checking his stat sheet, he grimaced. It was time to use some of them. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 2. Void Human, Advanced. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon. Elemental Mastery, 10%. Elemental Juggernaut, Tier 2 Legendary. Level 124. 188 free points. Strength. 805. Dexterity. 708. Constitution. 496. Resilience. 554. Intelligence. 532. Wisdom. 525. Divinity. 10. Health, 7440/7440. Stamina, 12075/12075. Mana, 7980/7980. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique. Nascent God, Transcendent. Lesser Xenocide, Legendary. Greater Giant Slayer, Legendary. Iron Will, Epic. Leader of Men, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Smite, Legendary. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Void Cannon, Legendary. Stamina Redirection, Legendary. Channeled Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Fists of the Hurricane, Epic. Battle Focus, Rare. Impact, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Journeyman 2. Runecrafting, Journeyman 1. Martial Arts, Journeyman 1. True Sight, Journeyman 1. Martial Path. Flowing Hurricane, Journeyman 1. Quests. The Strongest. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Complete Vengeance, SSS. With almost 200 stat points available, he could supercharge any of his stats. In fact, with his bonuses, he could break through his second threshold of strength. The mere thought of that made him pale, but he knew that he would need to do it sooner or later. As soon as this battle was over, he vowed, it was time. He raced towards the trio of Ashwalker golems next, ready to lend his hand to the battle. So far, it had gone far better than he had expected. Likely, this was to do with the presence of the two Uthraki juggernauts. A high-level fighter, especially one that was not inhibited by the low mana density, was a boon worth their weight in gold. Jonathan picked one of the golems that was not receiving as much attention as the others. It was in the process of creating a spear of lava out of the coursing pool at its feet, ready to throw it at the city. Jonathan interrupted the attack with a devastating blow to its right leg, one that drilled through it like it was made out of chalk. A cataclysmic shockwave of power raced outwards as his energy detonated in a storm of power within the creature's ankle joint. His hungering decay had opened the door, and his other skills blasted the door off its hinges. With a groan of breaking stone, the beast fell backwards, unable to support its weight with only one foot. As it fell, Jonathan raced up its leg, getting to its head by the time it slammed to the ground. The blunt visage of the golem looked up at him with a mindless expression, and the last thing it saw before it died was his fist descending, blazing with fiery light. At this point, his skills had been honed on far more powerful beasts from Tartarus, ones that were not inhibited by the mana. With such experience, dealing with a creature like this was child's play. It was only in the 120s in level after all, around his level, and with the effects of the world, it was quite a bit weaker than it normally would have been. A paltry amount of essence entered him, and he jumped off of the beast's head. There were still 2 more golems to fight. One of them quickly fell to the combined assault of Tucker, Eva and Edgar, but the last one was still free. It charged towards the city, seeing its brethren fall one by one. It likely wanted to get in one last hit before it died. The creature trundled along like a hill given life, causing the ground to shake beneath its titanic stride. At this rate, it would do serious damage to the city if it managed to set even a single foot within its walls. Although its level was lacking, its sheer size was a weapon all on its own. One of those massive feet could erase a house from the world before one could even blink. Jonathan roared in anger and launched a barrage of void cannons after the monsters, peppering its head with the concentrated bolts of mana and void energy. They slammed home unerringly, the practice that he had gotten with the ability showing. Each time they hit, chips of rock were blasted off the crudely hewn head of the monster. Still, it seemed content to continue blindly racing towards the city. At this rate, there would be no way to stop it in time unless he went all out. There was only one real way for Jonathan to reach it in time. With a roar, golden divinity swirled around his form, coating him in the light of the gods. Energy coursed through his veins, causing him to laugh out loud. With a primal scream, he rocketed forwards. The movements of the golem looked like it was moving through molasses. He reached its foot a moment later, and swung with all of his might, blasting his fist straight through the rock. His void-coated gauntlet ate through the stone like butter, fracturing the harder inner layer with ease. Jonathan roared and struck again, this time sending a tremor through the beast's leg. The golem shuddered, and began to fall. Straight towards the city. Jonathan cursed as he saw the massive body of the golem falling towards the wall. It would crush the defenders under its bulk like they were ants, and take out a good portion of the city defenses. There was only one thing left for him to do. With a sigh, he sent stamina to his legs, propelling himself forwards at many times the speed of sound. He appeared in front of the falling behemoth, standing on the wall, and rooted his feet in the ground. This was a desperate ploy, and one that would likely result in his death. However, he refused to let his city be marred by the attack of such a weak monster. If something as pitiful as an Ashwalker golem could deal such damage to his people, then the forces of Granath would undoubtedly destroy them. Jonathan tensed his muscles in preparation for the pain to come. Then, without giving himself time to think, he slotted all of his remaining stat points into strength. There was no time for him to allocate them in optimal-sized batches, but he did manage to divide the stat points into 4 portions. That granted him a few extra stat points for his trouble. He was going to need them. A few moments later, his body began to burn from the inside out, and he could feel his muscles liquefying. Time seemed to slow down, just to make the torment worse. The monster's fall decreased in speed until it was but a minor concern next to the unceasing agony that Jonathan was feeling. It was worse than anything he had ever felt before. It felt like he was being rebuilt, atom by atom, and each of those atoms was made out of acid. He stood there, in complete torment, for what felt like hours. However, in the real world, it was barely a fraction of a second. Some part of him, some unrelenting, godlike part of him, refused to give up, seizing control of the process with his willpower. He sped it up, heightening the pain to untold heights. His screams, if he had been aware enough to hear them, sounded like the cries of a tortured animal. However, the process eventually finished. He was left standing there, shaking violently, as the monster fell towards him. With a scream, fueled by the agony that he had just felt, he swung his fist, mustering all of his abilities as he went. His stamina propelled it forwards at unprecedented speed, his hungering decay created an inexorable coating of nothingness, and his mana created a core of explosive power, accentuated by his void elemental energy. As he was using Smite, he was unable to imbue his gauntlets with divinity. However, it hardly mattered at this point. With his threshold crossed, he had multiplied his strength by an incredible amount. He could sense that if not for his multiple boons invested into toughness, his strikes would tear his body apart. Even with them, fighting at full capacity like this was quite painful. He would need to allocate some points to resilience before long. However, none of that mattered now. His fist surged forwards, projecting a bow wave of force before it that caused the air to shimmer. A piercing howl rang out as it forced the air out of its way. As the titanic body of the golem fell, Jonathan cried out in defiance, his tiny form looking like an ant next to the pillar of stone falling towards his head. However, he was anything but. His fist made contact a moment later, and a blinding light erupted from the impact point, whiting out the vision of everyone nearby. Only Jonathan saw the effects of his blow. The golem seemed to fold around his fist, before exploding into dust. A beam of light pierced through its body and out the other side, just as this happened. To the observers, who were slowly regaining their sight, it appeared as if Jonathan had rammed a star through the monster's body. His body broke under the strain, and his right wrist shattered into dust. However, it had all been worth it in the end. He had saved his city from destruction. Darkness swirled around him, and he fell backwards off the wall. Jonathan came to in an unfamiliar location, surrounded by people. He was lying on a bed, uncovered by a sheet. His regeneration will get him through this, one voice said, with the scratchiness of advanced age. Jonathan tilted his head up, seeing an old woman peering down at him. She clucked disapprovingly at him, and gently pushed him back down into the bed. "You must rest. Whatever you did out there took a toll on you like no other. Is it dead?" Jonathan forced out through dry lips. The woman nodded, before walking away. Another figure raced to his side. This time, it was Edgar. "What did you do?" the man asked, his voice filled with anticipation. "How did you gain so much power?" "Free stat points are a resource that many do not use effectively," Jonathan chuckled, before coughing violently. Edgar seemed a bit confused, but he remained silent, seeming content to watch Jonathan from his bedside. In any case, he had some notifications to check. You have passed the second threshold of strength. In your journey of progression, you have learned that strength gained easily is strength unearned. A scion of a powerful family might be force-fed elixirs and natural treasures, but none of that strength can truly be considered their own. Only power, seized with a bloody hand from the jaws of defeat, is truly one's own. It was a short message, but one filled with meaning. Like the system's way of justifying the intense pain that crossing a threshold brought upon a person. Jonathan closed it, and clenched his jaw, fighting to avoid a torrent of trauma from the threshold crossing. Every moment of it was etched into his mind with lines of fire, and he knew he would remember it for years to come. Jonathan lay there for some time, shuddering as the memories of world-shattering pain coursed through his mind. In order to distract himself, he opened his status sheet once more. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 2. Void Human, Advanced. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon. Elemental Mastery, 10%. Elemental Juggernaut, Tier 2 Legendary. Level 124. 0 free points. Strength. 1105. Dexterity. 708. Constitution. 496. Resilience. 554. Intelligence. 532. Wisdom. 525. Divinity. 10. Health, 7440/7440. Stamina, 24863/24863. Mana, 7980/7980. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique. Nascent God, Transcendent. Lesser Xenocide, Legendary. Iron Will, Epic. Leader of Men, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Giant Slayer, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Smite, Legendary. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Void Cannon, Legendary. Stamina Redirection, Legendary. Channeled Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Fists of the Hurricane, Epic. Battle Focus, Rare. Impact, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Journeyman 2. Runecrafting, Journeyman 1. Martial Arts, Journeyman 1. Truesight, Journeyman 1. Martial Path. Flowing Hurricane, Journeyman 1. Quests. The Strongest. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Complete Vengeance, SSS. Jonathan choked as he saw the new number next to his stamina. It was no longer a multiple of 5, as the multiplier from his threshold was now 2.25 times, but it was still significant. He had almost doubled his total amount. Of course, such a huge boost would not come again for many levels. After all, he would need 10,000 strength to cross the next threshold. There was one more notification waiting for him as well. You have gained a new title. Forceful Initiate, Mythical. You have crossed the second threshold of strength while still in Tier 2. This shows one of two things. Either you are a prodigy beyond measure, or an idiot who focused entirely on brute force over all else. Bonuses, plus 10% boost to effective strength utilization. It did not give a stat boost, but it still seemed effective. Clearly the system did not want to reward a massive increase in stats with another boost in that same stat, at least numerically. He could feel that the title gave a different sort of boost to his stat. Rather than being physically more powerful, he was able to use it in conjunction with his other stats. That was probably why he hadn't killed himself while using his full strength, even though his resilience was below the second threshold. With the boosts of his threshold, he was now about 200 times stronger than an average human back on Earth. That was an utterly insane number. On Earth he had been able to deadlift about 300 pounds. Here he would be able to lift over 60,000. That was like an entire semi-truck. Then, now that he was thinking about it, that was not that impressive. Compared to comic book superheroes, he was a lightweight. People in those books had been able to destroy skyscrapers with a single punch, or even countries. Jonathan was very far from that. Now that he had gotten used to his abilities, he slowly got out of the bed. He had to be careful not to send himself flying forwards with a simple step. His dexterity was quite a bit behind his strength now, which meant that it was hard to regulate more complicated movements. With a slight effort of will, he limited his strength to the limit of what he could easily handle. Still, he was a lot more powerful than before. Once he got another 100 points or so in dexterity, he would be better off. Jonathan spotted his armor propped up against a wall, and he quickly donned it. With a grunt, he let the armor settle by shaking his body out. He had filled out a bit, and the armor was a bit tighter. That reminded him of a question that he had had about the dungeon run with Edgar. All of the suits of armor were the same size, but the two men were not. Did they fit to the wearer's stature when they were first put on? It was a lot more believable than the idea that it was simply up to luck. However, it seemed that this could only happen once, given the lack of room in his armor. Shrugging, he walked out of the building. It was time to develop more of his power. Asking around, he found that he had been out for over 12 hours. It was high time for him to go to Tartarus. This time, however, he planned on leveling up some more. After informing Edgar about his plans, he departed. He left without Edgar in case he ended up recruiting any more of the Uthraki. That was not his main goal this time though. With the knowledge of just how much power the second threshold granted, he hungered for more. It was almost enough to override the memory of the pain. Almost. It felt as if the system was increasing the receptiveness of his nerves, as the pain was far worse than he thought possible. Maybe it was simply removing the limiters placed by his high stats. Or perhaps, more frighteningly, the pain was far worse, and he was only feeling a fraction of it. Shuddering, he used the token, wanting to erase that thought from his mind. Jonathan appeared in Tartarus a moment later, standing within the village that Tucker had led. He left the village behind in moments, racing out into the volcanic plains of the realm. He had some big game to hunt. Spotting some likely prey a few miles away, a small herd of massive mammalian creatures, he raced towards their position. With his new strength, if he really let it loose, he could propel himself forwards far faster than ever before. It functioned similarly to his stamina redirection skill, in that he moved faster than his conscious mind could track. He flashed across the ground, covering the distance in less than 15 seconds. The monsters didn't know what hit them. They looked like bison, with long, shaggy fur that sparked occasionally. Embers fell from their long, matted manes of fur every now and then, flaring on the ground. Large tusks curled out of their lips, and their bodies were covered in dense muscle. Jonathan registered this all in the blink of an eye, before his fist hammered forwards. He let loose as much of his strength as he could, without using any other abilities. Before, the beasts would have likely been bruised by a punch from him, but the results this time were very different. Bones shattered, and the monster was torn off its feet, slamming into the ground a few dozen feet away. Jonathan's hand ached, but his regeneration reversed the muscular damage soon enough. The monster that he had struck struggled to move, but he had broken enough bones to make that impossible. The other monsters charged him, roaring, but he ignored them. Pumping his stamina into his body, he moved so fast that the air imploded behind him. He raised one fist, imbuing it with the light of the void, and then brought it down on the monster's brow. Its entire skull caved in, and gore splattered everywhere, painting his armor red. Essence rushed into him, sending him up another level. After the battle at the city, he had been hovering on the edge. A wave of power washed through him, but it was nothing like the power that he had gained from his threshold. Compared to that veritable mountain of potency, this was like a tiny stream. He kept moving, knowing that his durability was lagging well behind his strength. Although he could kill these creatures with ease, they could kill him if they got a solid hit in. He could scarcely imagine just how durable he would be if he reached the second threshold of resilience. His skin would be like metal at that point, and with his boons, perhaps it would be as hard as diamond. That was an intriguing thought, even more so than how strong he was in earth terms. However, he had a battle to fight before he could indulge. With a quick flip, he vaulted over a charging beast, slamming one fist down into its spine as he went. Bones buckled and vertebrae snapped, paralyzing the monster. He landed on its back a moment later, before raising one hand high above his head. With a devastating karate chop, imbued with the power of his mana and elemental energy, he split the monster in half, sending 2 ragged chunks of flesh falling to the ground. Essence poured into him, but it was of a negligible amount. He pushed it aside for now, and kept going. The remaining beasts were pawing the ground anxiously, knowing that he could kill them in the blink of an eye. Neither were they running, however, which was strange. Perhaps even prey animals in this world thought like predators. Jonathan stepped forwards, landing on the ground next to the severed corpse of his latest kill. His aura surged outwards, almost unbidden. With his new increases in strength, it was like an almost solid force, and for the briefest of moments, he felt a small connection to the world around him. Then it was gone as the dome of purple light rolled out. The hair on the monsters stood on end under the force of his aura, and they almost broke there and then, running away. However, one of them, some sort of alpha figure, roared in challenge, bolstering their wills. It was a lot larger than the other ones, standing about 5 feet higher at the shoulder than its brethren. This one was the true danger here. Jonathan had barely noticed it, however, so absorbed was he in his fight. He cracked his knuckles, and started running towards the latest challenger, his eyes blazing with power. The monster roared again and charged, a bloody red light limning its form. All of the monsters here seemed to draw from the same palette of magical abilities. Either they were earth-related, or some sort of empowerment skill. The charge left craters behind it as the beast broke the sound barrier, and Jonathan changed his course slightly. A full-on collision from the monster would likely break his bones to dust. Instead, he slipped by, raking his gauntlet along the length of the beast's body. As he did so, he used Mana Saber to create a long blade of energy that ripped through its skin, aided by his strength. At this point, his physical might rivaled that of a being many levels higher than himself, and it was showing. A mere rare ability should not have been able to pierce the skin of such a high-level monster, not without a truly egregious expenditure of mana. However, his physical might allowed him to push it in, cutting through tough flesh with ease. The monster roared in pain and whirled around, trying to dislodge the blade. However, it was made out of pure energy, and it was not as easy to break away from as a more mundane weapon. All that happened was that it dragged the blade through its body, cutting even deeper. Behind it, some of the other monsters seemed to gain courage and charged, seeking to protect their leader. Jonathan eyed them warily, and banished the blade, leaping up onto the back of the alpha. One of the other monsters flashed through the space that he was standing in, leaving craters in the ground. Before he could be bucked off, he started to wail on the alpha's back, sending tremors racing through it. However, this beast was on a different level to the others, and the strikes did far less damage than they had dealt to the other beasts. Instead of paralysis, all they resulted in were a few minor bone fractures, and profuse bruising. The monster reared up on its hind legs, and started to tip backwards, a mainstay for beasts when another was on their back. Jonathan knew how this rodeo went, and leaped over the monster's head just as it reached the point of no return. With a grin, he slammed mana down into his fist, and hammered it into the beast's underbelly. Blood and flesh exploded outwards, and organs ruptured under the apocalyptic strike. A desperate lowing noise rose up from the mouth of the bison-like beast, and it rolled to the side, getting to its feet. At this point, its body was in ruins. The only real challenge to Jonathan at this point was avoiding its hits. He danced around a clumsy swipe of its tusks, and almost fell into the path of another monster. They were starting to grow more accustomed to his fighting style at this point, which was dangerous to say the least. He needed to finish this. With a quick use of his stamina, he flashed forwards like a rocket, slamming his fully imbued fist into the center of the alpha's forehead. Its skull shattered under the blow, and another one finished it off. Almost double the essence that he had gained from the lower-level monsters rushed into him, and he let out a sigh of satisfaction. With the sight of their leader lying dead on the ground, the will of the other monsters broke, and they fled. Jonathan let them go. The amount of essence that he gained was not enough to warrant chasing them down. They could live, until some predator found them. Such was life in Tartarus. Jonathan spent the next day butchering his way across the volcanic plains. He made sure to avoid monsters beyond his ability to defeat safely. He knew that the defense of the city hinged partly on his presence, and it would be a mistake to endanger that unnecessarily. He gained less essence as a result, but at the rate he was killing, it hardly mattered. Over the course of the day, he killed hundreds of monsters, all of a higher level than him. That killing spree netted him another 5 levels, which was a bit less than he had been expecting. With the rate that returns diminished in terms of fighting monsters of a similar level, it would only be harder from here. Of course, he was already fighting up a gap that would have been almost impossible for most to clear. His threshold was helping a lot in this regard, granting him much more stamina than before. He had considered the reasoning behind his new mythical title, and had realized something. The path of a physical fighter was a lot more spread out than that of a mage. If one did not focus on all physical stats equally, to a certain extent, then it would cripple their ability to fight. Too much strength would cause injuries. Too much dexterity would result in the fighter's speed tearing them apart. Too much resilience would result in a fighter that could take hits, but not fight back. Finally, too much constitution would result in what was little more than a punching bag. Compared to this, a mage only had to focus on 2 stats. As Jonathan had a class that focused on all stats, it was hard to figure out where to place his stats sometimes. The promise of easy power always had to be tempered with caution. This was not a video game. He did not respawn when he died. After death, that was it. There was no coming back. He did not really count going to the hells as dying in any case, as his body had carried on. The hells were just as real as the rest of Telveria. They were simply dimensionally removed. In any case, Jonathan was only at the very beginning of his journey. There was a massive world ahead of him, if he could overcome the first hurdle in his path. Killing a Circle Lord. That was the goal that kept him training to his utmost, kept him spilling an ocean of blood in his path to the top. He was a far cry from the man he had been on Earth, both in terms of experience and in willpower. Sure, he had been cursed with a hard life on Earth, but if his old self had been forced to go through his latest threshold, he probably would have died from the shock. No, Jonathan was reforging himself into a being capable of impossible feats of strength, one that would one day rock the very world with his might. However, before that glorious moment came grinding. A lot of it. He kept going for another few hours, but eventually realized that he was running out of sufficiently leveled monsters to kill. Most of the beasts in this area ranged from level 150 to level 165, with a few at a higher level. That sort of level gap was enough to get him levels, but it would take a while. Even then, he was still progressing far faster than most would be able to. The thought of how long it would take to level if he had to fight monsters at his level was almost painful. It would take months or even years to clear Tier 2. Most inhabitants of this circle did not even bother with such things. One final kill netted him another level, but that was the last one for today. It was time to check up on the city. Jonathan teleported out of Tartarus from the top of a pile of corpses, appearing in his cave. Nobody was there, which gave him some time to ponder where to spend his free stat points. With his current imbalance, and the upcoming danger, he was not foolish enough to hoard them. He had 28 stat points ready to allocate, which was enough to grant him a bit over 40 if he allocated them in batches. With a quick effort of will, he sent 9 sets of 3 points into dexterity, netting him 45 points. The final point was saved for later. Jonathan could immediately feel his body stabilizing as it started to balance out his strength with his ability to control it. However, he would not be fully balanced until he managed to cross his second threshold in dexterity. For now, this would have to do. Jonathan strode down into the city, wanting to pay a visit to the Universal Trading Hub. He had a plethora of materials in his storage device after all, and he was eager to see what they would sell for. There were parts from many different beasts, all of which were Tier 2 in power. He would be able to get a tidy sum for those. He quickly made his way through the bustling streets, which seemed to fill up more and more by the day, and reached the line for the trading hub. He quickly got in line, patiently waiting for his turn. Many of the others there eyed him with respect, mingled with fear, but he paid them no mind. As he approached the portal, he went through the inventory of the items that he had picked up during his time in Tartarus. He had a plethora of scales from reptilian beasts, but also some fragments of rock from the golems. He had taken some of the obsidian lining of their bodies, which had been tough enough to repel his strikes. Surely that had to be worth something. He also had some tier 2 ores that he had picked up along the way. After having upgraded his armor and weapon, all that was left for him to do was to collect any tier 2 deposits that he could find. He suspected that the metal would be the most valuable item out of his stock. He had a few dozen pounds of tier 2 iron, as well as some tier 2 copper, which he had found near an Uthraki village. It had been an unexpected find, but he assumed that it would be good for something. With his inventory done, he surveyed the people standing in front of him, waiting to enter. Most of them were merchants, as there was hardly much opportunity for other citizens to amass stores of trading goods. The woman who had gained the ability in the first place sat by the portal, reading a book. It seemed that she gained essence from those who used the portal, as some sort of a tax. In any case, it allowed for her to simply sit there as the world went by. Over the last few weeks, her capacity for how many people could enter the portal had increased. Now, Jonathan saw multiple people entering and exiting at the same time. That would allow him to linger longer. Not that anyone would have stopped him, of course. He still would have felt bad about it though. By the time he had reached the front of the line, he was itching to get into the trading hub. He had been short on cash, as well as a way to spend it, for a while now. Sure, he had picked up a few hundred Leviathan marks here and there, but as he had seen from the prices in the trading hub, that was not enough to buy anything at his level. Eventually, it was his turn. He stepped through the coruscating portal, and into the trading hub. Jonathan appeared in the middle of the city like maze of stalls and merchants, quickly getting out of the way of the traffic. Everyone was on foot, but people still moved at the speed of their levels in the real world. This was the section that corresponded with the first few tiers, but there were still people who were clearly stronger than Jonathan here. He avoided them, and started down the road, looking for somewhere that he could drop his goods. When he had come to this world before, he had only explored a tiny area. However, now that he had more time, he started to roam the streets. With his superior memory, there was no way that he would forget the location of the portal. The stalls seemed to grow more ornate as time went on, and soon he began to see buildings. At the very end of the street was a massive hall, with a steady stream of people going in and out. That seemed as likely a place as any to dump his load of high-tier goods. He inserted himself into the line, and quickly entered the building, finding himself standing in the middle of a massive complex of what looked like pits. Each of them had a title floating above them, corresponding with the goods that they sold. There was one for armor nearby, as well as one for art. There was a clear imbalance in the popularity of the pits, as almost 10 times more people were standing around the weapons one than the art one. Jonathan quickly found the one he was looking for, one that said resources. He made his way over, and found that there were 2 sides to the pit. One of them had an informal auction setup going on, with people bidding with paddles for goods displayed in the bottom of the pit by an enthusiastic auctioneer. On the other side, people dropped off their goods at a stall, where they received a receipt. It seemed that the goods being bid on were those of the sellers, who stood to make a profit if they were lucky. Jonathan assumed that the auctioneers took a bit off the top as well. There were about 30 people waiting to peddle their wares, and Jonathan joined that line. Most of them had a few pounds of material at most, which made Jonathan feel better about his goods. Strangely enough, the highest tier of goods that he saw were tier 2 goods, which was strange, given that there were people higher than that rank here. Then he spotted the large door at the back of the room, likely leading to an auction area for higher-level patrons. Jonathan sighed, and simply waited in line, not really thinking about anything. 10 minutes later, it was his turn. He nodded at the auctioneer, a demure woman from some race unknown to him. She had human-like features, but far larger eyes than a human did. In addition, a tendril drooped forwards from her forehead, like an anglerfish. Jonathan spotted a depression in the table to place his goods in, and he began. Stuff began to pour out of his storage device in a tide, and the woman's eyes widened. Soon, the depression was overflowing, and he was told to stop. The woman pressed a button, and the table split in half, sending his goods down a chute. He then continued to unload. It took 4 rotations to fully process his wares, and he was given a strip of paper as a receipt. It was all itemized on the paper, telling him exactly what he had. The woman also handed him a paddle to bid with, if he wanted to. With a smile, he left the line, and headed over to the auction area. He wanted to see what his goods would sell for. "Do I have any bids for this exquisite set of wyvern scales?" he heard the auctioneer shout. "Starting at 3,700 Telvarian credits, or the equivalent." People began to raise their paddles, seeming excited about the set of 3 glowing sheets of bone, each of which created a mist of power around them. These were clearly pieces from a beast at the very peak of Tier 2. The bidding escalated quickly, and soon the price had risen to a whopping 7,500 Telvarian credits. Eventually it was sold to a slim woman in chainmail armor, who slunk away with her prize clutched tight to her chest. Jonathan had little money of his own, so he simply watched as the auction proceeded, seeing people walk away with goods that were worth more money than he had ever seen before, save for in Granath's treasury. Some people seemed to be interested in the rarity of the items as well as the power, perhaps needing them for the upgrade of a growth item. The most expensive item sold by far was a strange crystal from one of the Outer Realms that went for over 50,000 credits. The Outer Realms, from what Jonathan could tell, were a collection of subordinate planes, all of which were keyed to a different aspect of existence. There were ones for each of the major elements, and some for concepts as well. Their number was almost limitless, and nobody had ever fully charted them. Finally, the first of Jonathan's goods came up. "For our next item, we have a large quantity of Tier 2 iron. Over 10 pounds of it in fact. Any growth items will be satisfied by this amount, with enough left over for more. Bidding will start at 2,000 credits." Jonathan silently cheered as he realized the value of his item. The bidding quickly amped up, with one man, who clearly was outfitted with multiple growth items, brought the price up and up. It looked like he was a fan of metallic items, and likely needed the iron to upgrade them. The bidding did not reach the dizzying heights of the crystal, but it eventually petered out at around 5,000 credits. As expected, it went to the man with the surplus of metal. Jonathan felt his receipt briefly grow warm, and a tick mark formed on the paper next to the notation of Tier 2 iron. He smiled, and waited for more. When all was said and done, he walked away with over 30,000 Telvarian credits. Seeing as most of his buying would be done here, he saw little need to convert them to Leviathan marks. The exchange rate was downright predatory, and he was better off simply leaving it as it was. In any case, with his newfound wealth, it was time to search for something that would bolster his strength. He did not need any more weapons or armor, but he remembered the fruit from the dungeon that had allowed him to comprehend the conceptual nature of his element. Perhaps there were more of those around here. Jonathan quickly found an auction pit for natural treasures, and saw that the bidding was like a full-on war. The number of people outside of the pit was almost as high as the ones waiting for weapons, or armor. As soon as an item was put on display, the price skyrocketed, and as Jonathan neared, he saw people forking out tens of thousands of credits on appropriately tiered goods. He quickly inserted himself into the line, and watched as the next item was announced. "This treasure is a boon beyond any other for those following the sub-element of ice." The woman almost screamed. "A lotus, containing the concentrated power of 1,000 years of being steeped in the coldest ice of the barren peaks, will grant the user enough understanding to break through in their mastery of the element." The bidding was a bit more subdued for this one, likely as not too many people followed the sub-element of ice. Jonathan had heard of sub-elements before, but was not exactly sure how they worked. It seemed strange that someone would cut themselves off from the power of the main elements in favor of specialization. However, it wasn't like he was paying for them. It eventually sold for a hair over 12,000 credits, to a man who looked like a minotaur. He was almost 10 feet tall, and had large horns, with tufts of brown fur all over his body. The man rippled with muscles, and a slight aura of coldness swirled around him like a winter wind. He caught Jonathan staring, and gave him a hard glare. Jonathan quickly looked away. The next few items were similarly useless to him, but eventually something came up that seemed more valuable. It was a fruit that looked like a clenched fist, and seemed to radiate concentrated martial sight. For all the pugilists out there, this fruit is a must. Increasing the durability and hardness of your fists by an amount relative to your tier, it renders your punches far more powerful than before. Bidding will start at 6,000 credits. Jonathan immediately raised his paddle, calling out 6,500. A few other people in the crowd seemed to also be pugilists, and they upped the price, causing him to frown. The item was quite situational, but Jonathan wanted it. He kept escalating the price in response to the aggressive bidding of the others. Eventually, it plateaued at 15,000, at which point the others dropped out. Jonathan walked over to the booth to collect his prize, and quickly stored the fruit in his storage device. He had had enough of auctions for today. It was time to leave and check out his fruit. Jonathan walked back through the trading hub, and exited through the portal, walking past another one of his citizens. He had no idea what the merchants of his city bought there, but he had been told that the city's growth was at a record high. They had to be doing something right. He broke away from the crowd, and headed for his cave. If this natural treasure had some sort of vision attached to it, he wanted to be safe when he used it. Ascending the mountain, he pulled out the fruit and analyzed it. Fruit of the Diamond Fist. Tier 2 Natural Treasure. This fruit is steeped in the conceptual energy of a high-tier clash on the world of Telvaria. Growing from a mundane apple tree, the fruit was warped by the intense degree of weapon mastery that had been unleashed in the battle, turning into a reflection of one of the fighter's battle style. Consuming the fruit will greatly increase the durability of one's fists relative to their tier. It seemed safe enough, so Jonathan took a bite. The fruit was soft, and tasted vaguely metallic. He choked down the rest of it, and felt his fists begin to burn. He looked down, and saw that his armor was creaking as his fists expanded and contracted. The fruit dissolved in his stomach, sending tendrils of energy to his arms, which quickly were converted into layers of diamond-hard skin on top of his fists. Jonathan clenched his teeth as the burning intensified, but it stopped after a few moments. It had been nothing compared to the pain of his thresholds. Jonathan peeled off his gauntlets, noting the changes to his hands. His skin looked the same, but it was clearly thicker, and it almost seemed to have a crystalline structure to it now. It was hard to see, even with his advanced senses, but he could detect that the molecular structure of his skin had tightened. With a grin, he walked out of the cave, ready to test it out. He stood in front of the rock face a few minutes later, and began to wail on the mountainside with his fists. The damage that they dealt was almost as much as his gauntlets had done before. Not a single bit of pain radiated out from his fists as he struck, which meant that he would be able to use his new strength more effectively in the future. With a smile, he put his gauntlets back on. He was making a lot of progress. Perhaps he would be ready for the forces of Granath when they came. The next few days passed in the blink of an eye, split between training and recruitment missions in Tartarus. Jonathan found 2 more Uthraki conscripts, both of whom were weaker than Husher and Tucker. Still, they would be useful in the end. Maranta and Bordeg were a brother-sister pair who governed a large village together. Individually, their power was lacking, but they had honed the art of cooperation over their many years in Tartarus. They would be a great asset to the cause. More importantly, Jonathan had eked out another 5 levels from the monsters of Tartarus, once more allocating his points into dexterity. Combined with the natural treasure, his threshold-enhanced strength was no longer as much of a concern. He was as ready as he could get for the oncoming onslaught. As well as that, the city had prepared in earnest for the battle, reinforcing their defenses. All of the able-bodied fighters had leveled up with the help of Eva and Edgar over the last few days, bringing them closer to the top of Tier 1. Still, they would be greatly outnumbered, but that would not matter much. Jonathan was a match for an almost unlimited number of Tier 1s at this point. The same went for the other Tier 2 fighters of the city. No, the main problem was going to be the enemy Tier 2s. When the assault finally came, it did so with a sense of collapsing anticipation. An echoing hum rose up over the ash, the sound of tens of thousands of feet marching in unison. A tide of silver coursed across the ash, covering the horizon in front of the city. The artillery of the city began to fire as alarms blared. Streaks of energy and more mundane projectiles flew towards the oncoming army, the superior construction of the siege weaponry allowing for their loads to travel miles through the air. A catapult on Earth would have been hard-pressed to clear a half-mile. These ones could go over 10 times that distance. As the attacks hit, the enemy mages started to create a glimmering force field over the bulk of the army, resisting the strikes. A moment later, the Uthraki, who were waiting on a large tower of rock outside the city walls, began to combine their forces. A massive spike of rock rose out of the ground, trembling as it broke free of its earthly constraints. Faces pursed in effort, the Uthraki lifted the spike into the air, before launching it towards the enemy army. As if planned, a cannon on the wall shot a projectile after it, exploding behind the spike. The explosion launched it like a meteor, sending the 50-foot-long projectile hissing through the air. Jonathan watched eagerly as the spike impacted the force field. The field flickered and failed as the Uthraki exerted their will upon their creation. A moment later, the spike hit, sending a mushroom cloud of dust up into the sky. However, the main bulk of the army was undeterred. A few seconds later, they charged, heading towards the city walls. Behind them, a storm of magical projectiles rose up, launched by the Tier 2 mages of the Dread Legion. Arcing over the heads of the other soldiers, they flew towards the city walls. The mages on Jonathan's side created their own shields, but there was a clear difference in power between them and the enemy. Each shield shattered after even a glancing hit, allowing the strikes to enter the city. Houses were blasted into ruins by the strikes, but eventually, Edgar managed to create a swirling tornado of elemental energy that sucked up all of the projectiles. The Uthraki then layered their elemental mastery on top of the walls, creating bulwarks of stone. Those walls of rock caught the incoming projectiles, keeping them away from the city. They were quickly ground down to nubs by the barrage, but they held for long enough to be useful. By this point, the front lines of the enemy army were halfway across the plain, and Jonathan got a good look at the leaders. 3 fighters were at the head of the army, all of whom were crackling with dark power. A man, clad in midnight plate, wielding a sword that flickered in and out of reality was at the head. Next to him was a woman, holding a long crystalline staff. She was surrounded by a glimmering force field that was just barely visible from the walls. Finally, there was a red-skinned man wearing no armor at all, with his muscular body exposed to the world. He wore only a loincloth, and wielded a massive club made out of volcanic rock. All of them radiated power, but only the leader felt like a threat to Jonathan. The other 2 were on about the same level as Yalton had been. However, the man with the strange sword was even stronger. Despite this, it had been a while since the last time Granath's dogs had come calling to this city, and Jonathan had grown exponentially in power since then. He was not the same man who had almost died to that elven warrior all those weeks ago. He was stronger than that now. With a grin, he leaped from the walls, and started running towards the 3 leaders. Behind him, Edgar began to lay down supporting fire, creating a storm of wind blades that arced towards the front lines. As the tide of men and armor raced towards the city, Jonathan charged out to meet it, one man against a tide. He only had eyes for the leaders, however. With a roar, he leaped the last 100 feet or so, using his new strength to propel himself at high speeds. The enemy leaders stopped, and prepared for impact. The woman extended her shield around the two warriors, beginning to charge up a spell with her staff. Meanwhile, the dark armor-clad man eyed Jonathan up, and started to imbue his sword with energy. Finally, the brute grinned, and began to charge, his club raised high. Jonathan stood his ground, watching as the behemoth of a man bellowed a challenge. He was of the same demonic hybrid race as Rauner had been, the race that Jonathan now knew was the product of breeding between Uthraki and normal people by Granath. Before Jonathan could do anything, however, a flash of red streaked by him, impacting the warrior in the chest. Husher was revealed a moment later, his axe buried in the hilt of the club. The warrior pushed the Uthraki away, looking at him in surprise. "A progenitor?" he asked in confusion, before Husher struck again. "Do not sully my ears with your words, abomination!" Husher shouted in response, before whipping his axe back. He was more than evenly matched with the brute, as he had both a higher level, and no mana inhibition. Jonathan left the fight, satisfied, and headed towards the other two leaders. All around them, the rest of the army charged, ignoring the high-level conflict brewing in their center. Many of them simply jumped over the trench that the earth mages had built earlier, or charged across bridges of elemental power. It had been a good effort on their parts, but the secondary wall that the Uthraki had made would be a lot more useful here. Jonathan watched the tide of silver course by him, marveling at how weak the majority of the army was. He could have defeated them all had there been no Tier 2s. As it was, more and more Tier 2s started to come out of the woodwork, some of them heading towards the city, and others forming a circle around the duel between Jonathan and their leaders. Jonathan ignored this, and his fist started to crackle with dark flame. "Finally we meet, Jonathan Harlow. I have been looking forward to sinking my blade into your flesh. Your disrespect of my master has been inexcusable." The enemy leader twirled his sword as he said this. Jonathan was not in the mood for banter. He did not care who this man was, or why he was here. All he wanted to do was to remove the taint from his city's territory. The other man drew back his sword, meeting the strike with one of his own. Jonathan's fist clashed with the blade, struggling against the strength of the other fighter. Although the man was probably 30 or 40 levels higher than Jonathan, he was inhibited by the mana density of this world, and seemed to be having some trouble fighting against him. Jonathan spotted a strange medallion on the man's chest, out of which a steady stream of concentrated mana was pouring. Frowning, he realized that the artifact was able to slightly offset the mana inhibition. "Ah, you noticed my most prized possession," the man said. "My lord gifted this to me many years ago. With it, I am one of the strongest beings in this world. Only 3 others are stronger than me." As before, Jonathan ignored the banter and pushed the man's sword aside. However, it did not go the way he had planned. The sword phased through his gauntlet, and he only had the presence of mind to whip his hand back at the last moment. The sword flickered back into reality a moment later. If that had been a second sooner, it would have appeared in his hand. The battle all around began to heat up as the other Uthraki arrived. The female mage peeled away to fight them, and some of the other Tier 2s from Granath's army lent a hand. However, the main fight was going down right now, between Jonathan and the enemy leader. Jonathan knew that this man, with access to strength beyond the mana inhibition, would be a deadly threat to the city. However, they did seem evenly matched, at least in terms of strength. Jonathan surged in, sending a barrage of strikes towards vulnerable parts of the man's armor. Hissing nothingness crackled on the tops of his fists, ready to carve through armor, flesh and bone. However, none of that mattered if none of the attacks hit. The fighter weaved around them like a wraith, none of the blows hitting home. It almost looked like he was moving in and out of space like his sword. As Jonathan began to grow acclimated to the fighting style of his foe, he realized that was the case. The warrior was making small movements to conceal it, but more than once he should have been struck by one of Jonathan's attacks. With a bellow of rage, Jonathan began to up the level of his attacks. In between a series of punches, he suddenly loosed a bolt of void energy at the other man. Unprepared for this, he was struck full on by the blast. A detonation of purple light lifted the warrior off his feet and straight into the path of Jonathan's fist. This time, he did not dodge. He was sent flying backwards, crashing into the line of tier 2s like a cannonball. Jonathan raced after him, but was too slow to catch the man before he recovered. The warrior rose, spitting out blood through a slit in his visor, and grabbed his sword in a two-handed stance. With a growl, he rocketed through space, seeming to occupy every point between himself and Jonathan at once. He arrived almost instantaneously, thrusting his weapon towards Jonathan's neck. Jonathan leaped over the strike, bringing a devastating hammer fist down on the other fighter's head. The man raised his sword, using the hilt to block. His weapon moved like it was made of nothing at all, able to bend to his will with ease. Then again, he possessed the strength of a tier 2. Manipulating a sword like it was made out of air was par for the course. However, there seemed to be a little more going on there than just that. He had some sort of space manipulation abilities, ones that allowed him to move both his body and his weapon in improbable ways. He could phase through reality, and could move though things like they were not there. However, all elemental energy had a weakness, which was the effect of other elemental energy. Jonathan summoned his aura to the world, imbuing it with the concentrated power of the void. The other fighter stumbled for a moment as his abilities were suppressed. Then his own aura rolled out, fighting against Jonathan's. The two men struggled, but unlike the enemy leader, Jonathan did not need access to his elemental energy as an integral part of his fighting style. Without his space manipulation, however, the enemy leader was far weaker. Jonathan blocked, parried and punched as he moved around his enemy, sending in powerful blows that were just barely blocked. However, he was still unable to land any telling hits on his opponent. Eventually, he found that he was draining his elemental energy stores at a precipitous rate in his usage of his aura, and was forced to withdraw it. With a muffled laugh, the other fighter slipped his sword through a hole in space and into Jonathan's side. Jonathan roared in pain as the weapon entered his body, but he did not let that deter him. Gripping the sword with his hand, he began to flood it with the power of the void. The other man tried to pull it away, but Jonathan only increased the flow into the weapon of his opponent. He slowly pushed out the strange elemental energy that the man was using, claiming the sword as his own. In this world, elemental energy served as the means to do actual magic. Mana could work wonders too, but it was a far more austere form of power. The elements could actually control the function of the world around them. From what Jonathan could sense as he warred for control of the sword was that his enemy used some sort of dark elemental subordinate, which allowed him to manipulate space. Jonathan had learned from the diary that high-level dark elemental masters could control space, but for someone of this level to be able to do so meant that he had sacrificed the other powers of his element in order to be able to do this. This standoff felt like it took minutes, but it was over in less than a second. The other man simply let go of the sword and then whirled around, kicking the hilt deeper into Jonathan's body. However, that had been his plan all along. The weapon was not in a position where it could do fatal damage, and pain was inconsequential to someone like Jonathan. He whipped his hand out and grabbed the foot of his opponent, twisting with all of his strength. Something snapped, and the fighter bellowed in pain. Jonathan pulled his enemy in, bit by bit, coating his hands in the power of the void. The man tried to phase away, but he was unable to do so. With a brutal roar, Jonathan ripped the man's foot off, using every ounce of his threshold-enhanced strength. He leaped into the air, and then suplexed his enemy, breaking bones with the strike. However, before he could finish off his enemy, the nearby tier 2s made their move. A crystalline spear of power rocketed forwards, knocking Jonathan off of the body of his enemy. The man slowly crawled away, towards some sort of healer waiting on the sidelines. A perfect circle of calm had formed, its borders made from Tier 2 bodies. The circle of Tier 2s began to close in, and a moment later, all hell broke loose. 100 Tier 2s charged Jonathan in unison, causing him to lose track of the man crawling away from him. He jumped high into the air, gathering power into his fists. A corona of light blazed around his gauntlets as he came down, straight onto the heads of his enemies. Energy blossomed in a massive shockwave, ripping through the tightly packed Tier 2s. However, they were a lot more durable than most opponents that Jonathan had fought during his time in the ash heaps, and none of them died. As he landed, he was beset from all sides by a storm of blades and hammers, seeking to crush into the ground. Jonathan parried the blows to the best of his ability, relying upon his superior dexterity to keep him ahead of the onslaught. Even if most of the blows were moving in slow motion, as the wielders were just fresh Tier 2s, it was still a bit disconcerting to be surrounded so fully by enemies of this caliber. He returned the strikes that he took, sending his fists crashing into armor and flesh alike. With the effects of his natural treasure, his attacks were like pistons surging in and out, tipped with diamonds. Bones shattered every time he made contact with the enemy, and soon he was surrounded by a pile of broken bodies. Groans rose up from around him, and he grinned. This was no less than these foul people deserved for their crimes in the service of Granath. Some of the Tier 2s began to back away, but not because of fear. The leader had been healed in the meantime, and now seemed to be back in fighting shape. His leg had regrown, and he was no longer bleeding. "You are a great warrior, Jonathan Harlow. I will do you the courtesy of telling you my name. I am Malachi Esterlin, Lieutenant General of the Dread Legions. It has been some time since anyone has taxed me so in battle. I don't give a single shit what your name, or your title is," Jonathan snarled. "You are simply an enemy. Besides, what sort of self-proclaimed warrior uses the bodies of his subordinates as shields when he is overwhelmed? You are simply a coward, nothing more. Those accolades are hollow vessels, filled with lies." Malachi snarled, rage coursing through his veins. It had been a while since anyone had dared to talk to him like that. A haze of darkness rose up around him, the beginning of some sort of empowerment ability. The darkness sunk into him a moment later, causing his form to become somewhat incorporeal. This time, as he charged Jonathan, the rest of the Tier 2 fighters came with him. Obviously, this was only a fraction of the total number of Tier 2s, as many had charged the city, but it was enough to be distracting in a fight of this level. Jonathan ducked and weaved around blow after blow, as Malachi drew ever nearer. The man paused a dozen feet away, and then gripped his sword tightly, before pushing off the ground. His body cut through the air like an arrow, not seeming to meet any resistance there. Whatever skill he had used had made his body completely unfettered by the outside world. Jonathan suspected that if he was to jump up into the air, gravity would have no effect on him. Two of the other fighters tried to grab Jonathan, holding him in place. He simply pulled them together, and smashed their heads into paste against one another. His strength was above and beyond anything that this rabble possessed. Jonathan coated his fists with the light of the void, creating a haze of purple energy around each one. As Malachi neared, Jonathan punched forwards, expelling more of his elemental energy out of his hand. A mist of purple light rolled outwards, striking Malachi as he neared. Essence rushed into him a moment later. Jonathan grinned wildly, and turned his sights to the Tier 2s around him. It was time to show these misbegotten fools how much of a mistake they had made in coming here. On the city walls, the defenders were not faring nearly as well as Jonathan. Even as detonations of runic force erupted, blasting apart thousands of soldiers in the blink of an eye, the hordes just kept coming. Soldiers roiled in a seething tide beneath the walls, milling around in search for a way in. At least against the normal soldiers, the city defenders were somewhat of a match. However, there were far less of them. Even with the advantage of being the defenders, this was a situation fraught with danger. The walls were holding for now, as they had been made as thick as possible by the defenders of the city. However, siege engines were slowly rolling to position along the length of the structure, preparing to take it down for good. All of the fire from the ramparts was being directed towards the various war machines that were being brought to bear, seeking to take them out of commission. There were 5 battering rams, each of which was made out of black metal. Fire blazed around the heads of the battering rams, creating the illusion of a dragon's head. Judging by the amount of elemental energy packed into them, the fire would actually serve a physical purpose as well. Normally it would have simply sputtered out upon hitting the stone wall, but in this case, it was likely that it would burn through. In addition to those, there were a few catapults, already loaded with glowing balls of crystal. The projectiles were packed tightly with earth elemental energy, and if they hit, they would discharge a massive blast of concussive force, shaking the walls apart. Finally, there was a strange machine that looked like a cross between a carriage and a tank. It was massive, easily 50 feet long and 15 tall. Its end was covered with a large plow, sharpened to a razor point. An engine worked away in the center of the vehicle, using elemental energy and mana to propel the massive contraption. It looked like it could cut through buildings and people alike. As it approached, the catapults began to fire, now in range. Edgar sniped some of the balls of crystal out of the air as they approached, but many of the defenders were not as accurate. 3 of them struck home, sending up sharp cracks as they loosed their energy into the stone of the walls. Massive slabs of rock fell off the fortification, and the entire length of the wall shuddered. The catapults reloaded, preparing to fire again. By this point, the battering rams were in position as well, and they began to hammer at the wall, the ram itself thudding in and out, guided by the soldiers manning it. The walls shook steadily as the weapons slammed home again and again. A streak of red light flew in from the plains, towards the nearest battering ram. A wild battle cry rose up from the figure, and the light vanished, revealing Tukur. The Uthraki lifted his sword high, and brought it down on the siege engine, nearly cleaving it in half. He lifted it again, ignoring the desperate attacks of the engine's defenders, and summoned the earth to his bidding. A massive cleaver of stone formed around his sword, and this time, it carved all the way through. The charge of energy contained within the battering ram exploded, sending up a pillar of flame. The nearby soldiers were cooked to ashes, but Tukur was left unharmed. With a grin, he moved on to the next ram. Edgar smiled, and started to focus his fire on the rapidly approaching juggernaut of a carriage heading for the walls. Pillars of eolic power flew down from the heavens, rocking the carriage on its wheels. Spears of gusting wind rocketed down, tearing off chunks of the carriage. Although many of the enemy army was made up of Tier 2s, this carriage was not made out of Tier 2 materials. The cost for such a thing would have been prohibitive. As a result, it quickly fell apart before Edgar's onslaught. However, he was too slow to stop it from reaching the walls entirely. The carriage sped up at the last moment, in a display of defiance, and smashed through the walls with ease, coming to a broken stop in the side of a building. Edgar shouted in rage and brought a tornado of elemental energy down from the sky, turning the carriage into splinters. Soldiers charged in through the gap in the wall, entering the city. Most of the weaker citizens were holed up in the cave, surrounded by a network of defenses. Edgar and Jonathan had widened the cave, with the help of the Uthraki. With their earth manipulation abilities, they were the perfect builders. The space now could fit thousands of people for a decent amount of time, but it was not outfitted with anything in particular. A large boulder blocked the entrance, which would hopefully be enough to stop anyone from getting in. As the battle raged within the city, Jonathan focused on tearing through the Tier 2s. There was no way that he could be in 2 places at once, as much as he wanted to, so he simply had to take the devastation of his city in stride. He needed to trust in Edgar and Eva to defend it properly. His fists exploded out through bodies, pulping flesh and shattering bone. With his bonuses, and his level, he was many times stronger than these paltry specimens. Assuming that these soldiers had gained a slightly above par starting class, and the same for their Tier 2 class, they would only have a bit under 500 points in their main stat. Compared to that, Jonathan's strength was completely overwhelming. In addition, many of the Tier 2s had split their stat allocation, creating more weakness than would have been expected. Although they were marginally tougher to kill, it barely did them any good against the juggernaut of war that was Jonathan. As he worked his way through the weaker ones, the Uthraki dealt with the remaining two Tier 2 leaders. The red-skinned behemoths were one of the greatest assets in this fight. They were handily defeating their enemies, but the battle was being prolonged by the assistance of the other Tier 2s. While Jonathan had once felt awe for the Tier 2s of this world, now all he felt was pity. None of them had gone to the lengths that he had. For power, none of them had truly earned their levels. He had progressed to this height of power through sheer grit and determination. These fools had been coddled from the beginning, protected by the aegis that was Granath's name. Well, no longer. They were not invincible. Jonathan only had to prove that. Still, there were a lot of them, and they were not pushovers by any means, at least in a group. The mages constantly harassed him with their spells, dealing damage even through his armor. His skin was covered in a patchwork of burns and frostbite, mottled with massive bruises. His health had dropped by over 2,000 points at this point, but it hardly mattered. He had enough to spare. As he buelled his way deeper and deeper into the enemy lines, he found himself encountering stiffer resistance. Just the sheer weight of the enemy fighters was enough to inhibit him, especially with their high levels. Then again, all that meant was that they were fit for little more than being meat shields. That made Jonathan the butcher. His fists were his cleavers, and the ground was his cutting board. With a grin, he sped up, drawing upon his divinity to enhance his blows. Red light flared as his rune of hatred atomized enemy bodies. With the amount of energy that he could put into his runes, they were an effective fighting technique. In addition, his most potent ability, at least in this world, was his mana siphoning array. Without it, he would have been a third weaker than he currently was. With that sort of demerit, he surely would have died to the onslaught by now. Well, maybe not died. He was too strong for that. He certainly would have taken more than a few minor injuries by now though. The fighting rose to a fever pitch as mages began to layer enhancements upon their melee companions. The movements of the Tier 2s sped up, and their strikes became faster. Although Jonathan was overwhelmingly strong, he was not invincible. At this rate, his stamina would run out. Well, he had always been told to face his fears rather than run away. With a grunt, he sent his stamina into his fists, before punching forwards with all of his might. His fist tore through the air, his void energy empowering the strike. A blast of power shot forwards, tearing through the bodies of the soldiers in front of him. It left a long, thin crater in the ground. Jonathan raced along it, heading into the center of the fray. With a leap, he propelled himself into the air, and then came down like a thunderbolt, hammering his fist into the ground. The earth exploded upwards, and he grinned as soldiers were sent flying by the strike. Those two moves had taken out dozens of enemy fighters, but had depleted his reserve somewhat. He still had many more fighters waiting in front of him. However, once the Uthraki finished off with their battles, they could assist him. Jonathan had to hold the line in the meantime. As he fought, Husher sparred with the hulking brute of a man in the loincloth, sending the man stumbling with every strike. Although a small group of mages were constantly enhancing the brute with their spells, it was of no consequence. Husher was absolutely dominating the other fighter, and the only thing stopping him from winning more quickly was the durability of his opponent, and the efforts of the mages. In any case, he was in no danger of losing. Meanwhile, the female mage was being beaten into the ground by the Uthraki siblings. Although she was equipped with a host of spells, none of them were strong enough to defeat her opponents. Whips of light and shadow raked across their skin, but none of the attacks were potent enough to deal fatal damage. She was surrounded by a shield, but it was slowly being ground away by the attacks of the Uthraki. Her face was contorted in a rage-filled snarl, and she knew that her life would be coming to an end soon enough. A few minutes later, it was all over. The Uthraki hybrid brute fell to the ground, his head falling in a different direction. The mage was turned into a pile of bloody chunks as her shield ran out of mana. The Uthraki fighters raced to Jonathan's side, helping him deal with the tide of tier 2s. With their aid, he slowly pushed his way into the depths of the army, reaching the mages a few minutes later. As he butchered his way through their ranks, he grinned. There was nothing better than defending what you believed in. Essence rolled into him in tides, but it was so much lower than what he was used to. He did not gain a single level for his efforts, despite the massive numbers of tier 2s that he was defeating. As he fought, he slowly realized that this was nothing more than a distraction. Screams rang out from the city behind him, signaling that the enemy had breached the walls. Upon seeing this, the enemy fighters became emboldened, throwing themselves at him to prevent Jonathan from rushing to the aid of his allies. As he was dogpiled by the fighters, golden light exploded outwards, revealing Jonathan standing in the middle of a field of crushed bodies. Pure rage coursed through his veins along with divinity as he glared at those who dared to despoil his people. With Husher and the other Uthraki holding the line, Jonathan raced back towards the city, breaking through the sound barrier as he went. He reached the walls a moment later, transferring his energy into the nearest siege engine. It exploded into shards of metal and stone, raking across the nearby fighters. The soldiers were clustered around the spaces between the engines, trying to break through the weakened wall. The nearest cluster turned upon hearing Jonathan's approach, hefting their weapons. Thousands stood between him and the wall, but they were all far weaker than he was. Jonathan slammed his fists together, eager to fight. He raced forwards, straight towards the nearest concentration of fighters. As the front lines rushed into the city, Jonathan came in like a hammer from behind, tearing apart his foes in an expression of rage. He sent shockwaves flying through their bodies with every strike, and sometimes even those were enough to finish off his opponents. To people like this, Jonathan might as well have been a god. The tier 2s were stuck behind the implacable wall of the Uthraki, and the ones that were present at the wall were too preoccupied with getting inside. However, there were far more soldiers than even Jonathan could deal with in a reasonable amount of time, especially considering that they had breached the city. Within the city, the guards fought with the Dread Legion, fighting for every inch of ground that they gave up. Most of the guards were nearing the peak of Tier 1 at this point, and were more than a match for their enemies individually. However, they were vastly outnumbered, and the best that they could do was make a fighting retreat. Many of them were dying, falling to the forest of blades in front of them. Jonathan took a look around the battlefield, and upon seeing that the path was clear in terms of powerful Tier 2s, he let loose. There was nothing more for him to save his energy for. Divinity pulsed through his body like the world's greatest drug, filling his limbs with power and speed. Whereas before he only appeared as a blur to the lower-level soldiers, now he was entirely invisible. Swathes of the army vanished in seconds as he plowed through them, not bothering to even use his fists. Armor and bone crumbled beneath his charge, pulped by his sheer strength. Thousands died within the next few minutes, and Jonathan single-handedly cleared the breach in the wall. The guards that had survived raced to fill the gap, flashing him glances of awe. Jonathan simply gave them a nod, and was off, speeding away on legs enhanced with stamina. He flashed like a purple and gold meteor across the battlefield, tearing apart every enemy soldier that he could find. Knowing that he would run out of power long before the last one had died, he focused his efforts on the ones piling in through the breaches in the walls. By the time he was nearing the end of his tether, he had made enough space for the city guards to mount a defense, aided by Edgar and Ava. With a terse smile, Jonathan leaped onto the wall. It was time to finish this. Soldiers of Granath, he bellowed. Your leaders are dead, and all that lies in your future is death. You might succeed in taking a few of my allies down with you, but you will still die regardless. Why throw away your lives for an uncaring master? Instead of having an effect on the soldiers, as Jonathan had been expecting some sort of reaction, even if only a small one, they instead stiffened up, pausing in motion. Jonathan, a sibilant whisper rose up from the massed soldiers. You are proving to be a rather unique nuisance. Unfortunately, your little display of wordsmithing will not save you. My soldiers are bound to me, body and soul. Although they might die here, so will you. A moment later, pillars of dark power shot up from the soldiers, reaching the sky. When they faded, demonic figures were left behind. All traces of humanity were gone, replaced with bestial rage. Jonathan suspected that such a transformation came with a hefty bonus to strength as well. The monsters threw themselves at the wall like wild animals, not even trying to enter through the breaches. They were a lot stronger now, however, and they raced up the wall like monkeys, using the tiny gaps in the stone as handholds and footholds. Jonathan screamed in frustration, and ran towards his foe. The Uthraki were still tied up in battle against the Tier 2s of the army, and if they came to his aid, the battle would grow far worse. The Tier 2s had been affected by the transformation as well, and were likely far stronger than their Tier 1 brethren now. Tucker was here, but even with his strength, there were too many soldiers to deal with. If this had been an open field of battle, Jonathan and his strongest allies would have eventually beaten their foes, but this was different. They needed to defend their city's weakest citizens from the attack. For that to happen, they needed to execute their maneuvers with incredible speed. Even now, monsters spilled over the wall, falling into the city like heralds of the end. They threw themselves at the defenders, burying them underneath piles of scrabbling violence and twisting armor. Jonathan exploded into motion, desperately drawing divinity from his void elemental energy like he had done once before. The effort was incredibly difficult, but he was able to eke out enough power to continue the effects of smite for a bit longer. The golden glow was purple now, but there was no other real difference. He leaped down into the city, landing next to one of the twisted hulks of flesh and armor that the soldiers of Granath had turned into. With devastating blows, he tore the beasts apart, each punch splattering bodies. He flitted between them like a wraith, but his lack of effective area of effect damage was starting to weigh on him now. Edgar was having more success in the field, with his wide-ranging wind elemental attacks. Tornadoes of scouring wind touched down in the midst of the enemy soldiers, turning them to ribbons of flesh. However, even then, it was too little, too late. If there were 5 fighters like Edgar, then perhaps this would have been doable with fewer casualties. As it was, the guards of the city stood in the direct path of the enemy onslaught. They knew by now that there was a good chance that they would never make it out alive. However, they seemed to be resolved to their fates. Jonathan felt pride at the resolve of his citizens, but also rage that he was not strong enough to help them. As he pondered this dilemma, something stirred inside of him, something ancient and powerful. Rather, it was the ghost of something ancient and powerful. Sarnathros had slumbered within Jonathan's soul for the last few months, gathering power once more. He had been awake for most of the time, but utterly impotent. He had watched Jonathan's journey to the top with eager eyes, proud of his scion for his achievements. Jonathan was already far more impressive than any of the brats that the other gods called their chosen. He had been feeding off of Jonathan's divinity pool, a little bit at a time, and now had enough power left to speak with his host and perhaps aid him. Jonathan, he whispered from within his confines. I can help you. Who? Jonathan thought as he butchered his way through more soldiers. Wait, Sarnathros. Are you finally awake? I am. I can see that you are in trouble. Perhaps I can remedy that. You will need to lend me control over your remaining divinity. Normally Jonathan would have thought over a thing like that for far longer, but he did not have much of a choice here. Instead, he let Sarnathros take control. It was like a hand had clamped down on his divinity, one that was far more experienced at guiding it than he was. Every last drop of his divinity seemed to explode in potential, but really, it was simply being used to a divine standard. Power rippled through Jonathan's body, and he desperately tried to memorize some of the insights from Sarnarkthro's efforts as he went. A moment later, he realized what was going on. Sarnarkthros was using his divinity like it was made up of tiny grains of power, rather than a rolling ocean of energy. Every grain that he added was another speck of power, and with his level of control, there were many grains indeed. It looked like the key to increasing his mastery over Smite was through partitioning his divinity. With the newfound might burning through his veins, Jonathan exploded into motion, moving far faster than before. He used every ounce of his power, sending shockwaves racing out as he ran. This version of Smite was far more powerful than anything he had known before, and he made as much out of it as he could. At this speed, it looked like his enemies were standing still. However, he knew that this effect would eventually run out if he did not use it effectively. His divinity storage might have been in expert hands, but it was far too small for any sort of prolonged usage. However, he did not need long when he could move as fast as he could. 10,000 fighters died in the next minute, and another 10,000 over the next. As his divinity came to an end, he had created piles of corpses in the gaps of the wall, stemming the tide of enemies somewhat. His guards had gained a valuable breather as well. Jonathan collapsed to the ground as the aftereffects of Sarnarkthro's piloting came to bear. He was utterly exhausted, worn out from the effort of controlling the roiling tide of divinity that had coursed through him. He searched through his soul for a sight of Sarnarkthros, but the fallen god was gone. He must have used up the last of his energy in aiding Jonathan. The artillery on the walls fired down in a steady rhythm, and Edgar sent his own abilities chasing them. Still, there were tens of thousands of fighters left. Almost half of the army was gone now, but the soldiers had all gained considerable power. This was not going to be an easy fight. Jonathan jumped onto the wall when he had recovered, wanting to check on the Uthraki. The fighters were holed up in a fort of obsidian, relying on the bestial instincts of the transformed fighters to funnel them into the center of the trap where they were quickly killed. They were killing them quickly, but not quickly enough. A few moments later, Jonathan was ready to fight once more. He leaped off the wall, gathering energy in his fists. Coming down like a falling star, he slammed his fist into the nearest concentration of fighters. A shockwave of power raced out, pulping their flesh. Jonathan got to his feet and strode forwards, towards the Uthraki outpost. Many of the enemy soldiers were heading towards them now, frustrated by their inability to breach the walls. Jonathan raced towards them, gathering power in his fists, readying himself to strike. It was time to finish this farce once and for all. Granath had underestimated the strength of Jonathan's city. He had sent 100,000, when he should have sent 1,000,000. He screamed his rage out to the uncaring skies, rage from both the deaths of his allies, and his inability to save them. Blazing fires of purple light rose up from his fists, shading his form in a dark light. He threw himself the last few hundred feet, coupling his strength with his stamina to almost fly through the air. The bestial creatures that had taken the place of the soldiers charged him eagerly, frenzied grins on their twisted features. His fists came down and smashed into flesh, tearing apart the monsters. One hand snaked out to grab a sword, which he used to bisect a dozen monsters in one go. As they rushed him, he used his martial arts knowledge to mitigate the stamina drain that he was experiencing. His various skills worked in unison to ensure that he did maximum damage with each strike. He painted a path of red ruin across the battlefield, cutting a swathe through the enemy lines. However, there were too many for him to deal with on his own. The Uthraki and the other Tier 2 fighters raced towards him, already gathering their skills to strike. Pillars of rock lanced through the air, followed by massive tornadoes of razor-sharp wind. A spectral spear lanced forwards from where Eva was, cutting through a few dozen monsters with a single strike. A half-hour later, the tide had fully turned. Almost all of the enemy soldiers were dead, their corpses littering the ground. Jonathan had gained another level from this display of butchery, bolstering his strength more. He let the power course through his veins for a moment, watching the monster's retreat. Jonathan's stamina was almost completely gone, as well as most of his mana. However, just as he began to celebrate his victory, a thunderous rumbling noise rose up from the distance. Jonathan's heart froze, and he stood still. A moment later, a massive snake, made out of earth and fire, slithered into view, its eyes blazing with fiery light. The monster was easily a mile in length, but it did not seem to be a natural being. Instead, it looked like it was some sort of summon, or construct. Jonathan had no doubt who had made it. Only one creature in this misbegotten world would have the power to make such a thing. Granath. Jonathan pursed his lips and started to run towards the incoming foe, rather than retreating. If he let the monster get to the city, it would destroy it in an instant, whether he was there or not. However, if he was able to kill it miles before it actually reached its target, perhaps he could save his people. The other Tier 2s caught onto this rapidly, and followed suit, racing across the plain. The monster moved like a regular snake, bunching and extending its sinuous coils. Only, in this case, those coils were hundreds of feet in diameter. It was an imposing sight, one that would have struck fear into the hearts of lesser men. Jonathan was no lesser man. He reached the monster a few minutes later, traveling at his top speed. This close, the earth itself trembled beneath the titanic motions of the monster. It did not seem to notice Jonathan and his small group, instead single-mindedly focused on its target. Jonathan leaped onto its side, grabbing onto a thick outcropping of rock. The monster was hot to the touch, but not painfully so. Jonathan clambered up its side like a monkey, reaching the top a few moments later. His allies followed suit, with Edgar simply floating up. "How do you plan to defeat such a massive monster?" Eva whispered. "Constructs like this usually have a concentration of power somewhere," Edgar said. "I assume that Jonathan means to destroy that. Generally, such things are located in a monster's head." Jonathan simply nodded, confirming Edgar's suspicions. The man nodded in return. They were standing near the snake's head, and now that they had a vantage point, it was quite clear that there was something unnatural in there. There was a large bulge on the base of the head, one that glowed faintly. That must be where the power center is. However, we need to be quick. If we strike, and do nothing, the monster will be alerted to our presence. "What exactly is it going to do though?" Tucker asked. "It lacks hands or legs. Will it roll over and crush us?" He seemed faintly sarcastic at the last bit, as he had never encountered a beast like this. In Tartarus, all of the monsters were optimized to their environment. A creature like this would have been torn apart in seconds. In the ash heaps, however, this creature was a dire threat. "If you look closely, you will notice the fire elemental energy contained within this construct," Edgar replied. "Monsters like this generally have some sort of expulsion ability in order to defend against smaller threats." "All right," Jonathan said, impatient. "Now that we've established the basic facts about this creature, can we actually get to work?" Chastened by his rebuke, the others nodded. Jonathan raced forwards, feeling Edgar's buff spell take hold. Speed filled his limbs, and he let out a whoop as he ran. Void energy coursed down his arms, filling them with caustic power. Eva and the Uthraki fighters followed behind him, gathering their own power in preparation to strike. Jonathan leaped into the air, bringing his fist down. As he did so, Eva blurred forwards, her spear glowing a brilliant green. Tucker lifted his sword, summoning dense obsidian to gird its form. Husher did the same with his axe. The attack struck at the same time, blasting apart the snake's rocky flesh. Tons of earth were tossed up into the air, revealing a massive crystal beneath the surface of the monster. However, it was now aware of their presence. Without warning, the ground underneath their feet started to liquefy, turning into searing molten rock. Jonathan only managed to jump up in time to avoid the strike. The others were not as lucky. Edgar was seared by the roiling lava, as it sent its heat straight through his armor and into his body. The smell of burning flesh rose up as Edgar desperately tore himself away with his control over the wind. Even though the man had not been touching the lava, it was still hot enough to burn him severely. He rose a few dozen feet into the air, hissing in agony as his feet sizzled within his boots. However, the man kept the pain to himself, focusing on laying down suppressive fire. The newly liquid matter that made up the surface of the snake was a lot easier to dislodge with wind than it had before, and Edgar sent waves racing across the lava with his elemental mastery. The melee fighters that accompanied Jonathan were caught fully unawares by the attack, and their flesh burned under the onslaught. Luckily for them, their durability was sufficient to keep the injuries from becoming anything life-threatening. Jonathan knew that the fight was entering a new phase, and it was time for him to bring out the big guns. His newfound understanding of Smite was sitting in his mind, waiting to be used. Jonathan drew upon his divinity, visualizing it as a series of disparate parts instead as one liquid whole. Energy poured out of his stores and into his body, filling him with strength. As the power grew and grew, he began to slam his fists into the surface of the snake, ignoring the lava. In his current state, the molten rock was nothing more than a small annoyance. His durability was boosted somewhat while under the effects of Smite, and while it was not as much of a boost as it was to his strength and speed, it was still quite significant. The lava poured off his hands as he raised and lowered them, pooling beneath his feet. Soon he was able to clear a large enough hole in the lava to begin his assault in earnest. Edgar helped out by keeping the lava from sliding back into place. As the snake continued to move, Jonathan attacked like his life depended on it. His fists rose and fell with the cadence of a machine, sending cracks across the stony surface of the monster. The snake seemed unperturbed by the assault, however, as it was too large to really feel the effects. Jonathan started to move forwards, towards the crystal that controlled the monster. The others moved as if to follow, but the ground behind them started to bubble, revealing a group of elementals that had sprouted from the skin of the snake. They were made out of lava and rock, and came in a variety of different forms. Some of them were tall and lithe, wielding whips of heat. The others were shorter, but also far stockier, clutching large hammers of volcanic rock. Jonathan kept moving, knowing that his allies would support him in his endeavor. The others turned around, and engaged the newcomers, sending chunks of rock flying with their assault. The elementals put up a decent fight, however, and soon the entire area behind Jonathan was embroiled in battle. This snake was not really a threat to any of them, save for his lava abilities. It was more of a threat to the city as a whole. It had been made to mindlessly attack its target, ignoring any obstacles that it encountered. After all, there were very few obstacles that could actually stop such a creature. If Jonathan was to hope to defeat it, he would have to be one of them. Ropes of golden divinity twisted and turned around his body like a series of solar flares, painting the ground around him in light. His void energy surged to his fingertips, ready to unleash its wrath upon the snake. Jonathan bounded forwards, leaping towards the exposed crystal. Just as he neared, however, the rock began to close up, as if taunting him. He snarled, and brought his hand down with all of his might, breaking the rock in half. The crystal was revealed once more, and he began to attack. His fists rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and the gem began to crack. This time, the snake felt it. A tremor ran across the length of the beast, almost knocking Jonathan off his perch. He held on tight, however, and continued his work. The tremors grew more violent, and the monster sped up, as if trying to do as much damage as it could before dying. Jonathan was forced to speed up as well, as the monster had reached the outer city limits. Within a half-minute, it would be in position to attack. The crystal was not especially durable, but it was very large, making his task harder than it should have been. As the crystal began to splinter, the monster was mere seconds away from its target. A rain of artillery fire flew up from the city, but it was nothing more than a distraction to the powerful construct. Just as the crystal finally shattered, killing the monster, it slammed through the city walls, kicking up a massive spray of dust. Coughing, Jonathan watched as it came to a halt. The lava began to cool instantly, and he hopped down. The monster had only made it a few dozen feet into the city, which was quite lucky. It could have done far more damage than that. With the death of the construct came the death of its summons, and his companions were freed of their battle, as the elementals fell apart. Essence poured into him, but to his surprise, it was not enough for a level. All that the snake had going for it was its size, which was a weapon in its own right. Other than that, there was nothing really special about it. That it had probably been only a little higher level than he was. Jonathan dusted himself off as he landed, smiling. There was a skill notification waiting for him. You have upgraded a skill. Smite, Legendary - Greater Smite, Mythical. The pursuit of divinity is a task that takes eons to complete. Although divinity might seem simple on the outside, it contains an entire world of power. The heights of power that one can reach with it are almost limitless, and the only constraints are imagination and mastery. In witnessing the talent of Sarnathros, Sovereign of the Apocalypse, albeit in a much reduced state, you have gained an important insight into the nature of divinity. In using this newfound mastery, you may transcend your limits. The new name of his skill was unimaginative, to say the least. However, it was accurate. He now possessed a second mythical skill, a valuable addition to his arsenal. As Edgar floated down, looking for healing, Jonathan started towards his cave. The Uthraki would likely be wanting to return to their homes, and he would not stand in their way. The red-skinned humanoids followed him, but to his surprise, they stopped outside of the cave. "We have decided to remain here for a little longer," one of the siblings said. Jonathan still did not know their names. "This cause is one that we find more valuable than our lives in Tartarus." The Uthraki then bowed to him in unison, surprising Jonathan with the motion. "Well, I suppose you are free to do that," Jonathan mused. "I will not stop you, especially when your desires serve my own purpose." Very well. The city and faction as a whole was now into the final stretch of the war against Granath. With his legions defeated, and his snake line broken outside of the city, Granath had been dealt a serious blow. In the Ashen Citadel, the earth trembled as Granath directed his rage into the world around him, using his magical abilities to tear apart the ground. He roared in pure wrath, as he came to terms with what had happened. A large portion of his higher-level soldiers had died. A large fraction of the Tier 2s in the entire realm were now dead. It was all Jonathan's fault. For the first time in a while, Granath felt something other than anger and a smug sense of self-confidence. He felt fear. Despite all of his efforts, Granath was unable to kill his foe. If he simply kept sending soldiers after him, then he would lose them all. No, he would have to be patient. Jonathan would come here eventually, and would learn the true meaning of power. When he had last fought against him, Granath had only used a fraction of his strength, so as to not destroy his city. If it came down to it, however, he was fine with that. His life mattered more than those of his citizens. There were always more damned souls after all. Granath slowly worked the anger out of his system, taking deep breaths to calm himself. Every person within a mile cowered in fear of the worm, and only stopped when they were sure that his tantrum had ended. Granath fumed for a while, and eventually came to terms with his condition. He could do nothing about it in his current situation. Anger would only undermine his authority. It was time to prepare. Jonathan would likely be coming within the next few months. Although all of the odds were against him, Jonathan still sent a thrill of fear through Granath's mind. Acting upon his fear, he began to withdraw his higher-level forces from their stations, calling them back to the capital. It was time to prepare for full-on war. Sarnathros drifted through the ethereal veils of Jonathan's innermost soul, drawing power from his surroundings. The fallen god was in a curious state of being. He had ranked up from being within Jonathan's soul as he had ranked up, but there was little he could do with the power. He was still weaker than a new Tier 1. There was nothing he could do, save for guiding Jonathan in the realm of divinity. Even making his presence known took a lot out of him, and it would be a while until he recovered fully. He was stuck here until Jonathan reached a level of power sufficient to allow him to leave. Even then, he would be bound to Jonathan until he reached a level of power high enough to survive on his own. His existence was in jeopardy, at the complete mercy of his host. If Jonathan died, so would Sarnathros. If at any point it was decided that Sarnathros was an unwanted parasite, he would be expelled. After all, he was taking a portion of the essence that Jonathan was earning. It was a small amount, but noticeable. It was lucky that Jonathan had no idea what he was supposed to be earning in terms of essence. In any case, Sarnathros was able to make it worth Jonathan's while in terms of the power that he offered. Besides, if nobody found out, then there would be no problem. Smiling slightly, Sarnathros let sleep take him, and he simply floated through the streams of colored light that surrounded him. He would be out of commission for a while. A few days later, Jonathan found himself in Tartarus, hunting monsters with Edgar. The other man was gaining power almost as rapidly as he was. Jonathan's leveling speed had slowed down even more, as he was not yet confident enough to challenge the strongest beasts of this realm. Edgar was doing better, however. The man was only a few levels below Jonathan at this point, who stood at level 141. Both of them were far stronger than they had been upon entering this rank. By the end, Jonathan hoped to have crossed most of his thresholds, if not all of them. Only that would grant him the power he needed to defeat Granath. He was nearing the second one for dexterity, which would allow for him to balance out his prodigious strength. He was sitting around the middle of the 800s in the stat, so he would need a bit more in terms of levels before he could reach his goal. He was looking forward to the leap in strength that he would gain from this. As he and Edgar slowly and monotonously slaughtered their way through the weaker creatures of Tartarus, he was granted quite a bit of time to reflect on his plans for the future. In the near future, his most important task was gaining enough strength to defeat Granath, and free the ash heaps. That would mean finding more powerful skills, and boosting his stats to the maximum. Ranking up his pathway skills would be useful, but not entirely necessary, or indeed feasible. Taking his journeyman rank skills to the next rank would take months, time that he did not have. His momentum was the only thing keeping him moving, and if that disappeared, then he would be left bereft of purpose. He kept fighting alongside Edgar for a while, using his faction sheet to keep an eye on the status of his city. Time seemed to blur as he fought his way across the plains. A wake of corpses was left behind him, creating a trail across the area. They had covered hundreds of square miles in search of prey, and the area was starting to grow bare. However, as long as Jonathan was able to keep apprised of the situation in the city, he was happy. Time was of no consequence to him for now, as there was no upcoming attack. Like before, any decrease in the number of citizens would mean an attack. Luckily for him, however, no such attacks came, and he was able to stay in Tartarus, leveling up to his heart's desire. He had a very solid base now, and the only thing to do was to add more to it. If his titles, elemental energy and pathway skills were the foundation, then his levels were the building that he built on top of it. Eventually, the weaker monsters simply stopped giving enough essence to be worthwhile, and he was forced to reevaluate their path. "I think it's time to go further afield in search of enemies," Jonathan said, as Edgar came to a stop next to him. As the man floated down from the air, he nodded. "Do you think we're ready to take on one of those cities? Both of us have increased a lot in strength since we first came to this world." "I believe that might just be the case," Jonathan replied. "Let me check my stat sheet. I might be hovering on the edge of another threshold. If that is the case, I might as well do it now. I'm fine with you seeing me crying like a baby. I'm not sure about the Uthraki." Jonathan laughed at the end, trying to console himself with the light bit of humor. Before starting, he steeled himself for a possible threshold ceremony. Without waiting any longer, he opened it. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 2. Void Human, Advanced. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon. Elemental Mastery, 10%. Elemental Juggernaut, Tier 2 Legendary. Level 149. 45 free points. Strength. 1220. Dexterity. 903. Constitution. 611. Resilience. 659. Intelligence. 647. Wisdom. 640. Divinity. 10. Health, 9165/9165. Stamina, 27450/27450. Mana, 9705/9705. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique. Nascent God, Transcendent. Forceful Initiate, Mythical. Lesser Xenocide, Legendary. Greater Giant Slayer, Legendary. Iron Will, Epic. Leader of Men, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Greater Smite, Mythical. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Void Cannon, Legendary. Stamina Redirection, Legendary. Channeled Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Fists of the Hurricane, Epic. Battle Focus, Rare. Impact, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Journeyman 2. Runecrafting, Journeyman 1. Martial Arts, Journeyman 1. True Sight, Journeyman 1. Martial Path. Flowing Hurricane, Journeyman 1. Quests. The Strongest. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Complete Vengeance, SSS. To his relief, he was not quite there yet. However, he would be in a few more levels. With his free stat points, he almost had enough already. Letting out a sigh of relief at the fact that he could postpone the ceremony for a little longer, he closed his sheet and shook his head at Edgar. I'm not there yet. I should be in a few more levels though. The rate at which you cross thresholds is nothing short of astounding, Edgar replied. You are able to keep all of your stats relevant, not just those relevant to your fighting abilities. Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if I would be better off focusing on a few. Imagine if I neglected my mental stats, and had the physical ones of something many levels higher than me. I could have been past all of my physical thresholds by now. Yes, but you would have been a dumb brute, compared to the man you are now. Back on Telvaria, we call that the meat shield factor. Those who focus on their bodily strength over all else are not weak exactly, but they are known for their stupidity, Edgar replied. They are often manipulated by those far smarter than themselves. Wouldn't just a few points into intelligence make up the difference though? You overestimate the strength of the classes that many gain. Most classes only give stat points to relevant stats. Some even provide demerits to stats that are not aligned with their nature. In addition, only higher rank classes give free points. For most, they are stuck in the path that they have chosen. So it's not exactly their fault then, Jonathan replied, starting to get on his way. Edgar floated up into the air beside him, keeping pace. Not exactly. However, those who choose such classes are not exactly bright to begin with. Not all classes are made the same, and not all people are either. Jonathan gave the man a look, but he seemed perfectly happy to stand by that statement. On Earth, saying something like that would have gotten him into a lot of trouble, at least in the political environment that there had been when Jonathan had left. However, in Telvaria, it was true. There was no such thing as equality in a world where people could become akin to living gods, where the children of nobles could come out of the gate with as many benefits as could be crammed into their mouths alongside the silver spoon that they were born with. Edgar seemed to be out of things to say, and the men simply kept walking. Jonathan took advantage of the long trek. Without monsters to investigate his skills. He wanted to get some headway on his abilities with mana manipulation, as well as his elemental mastery. Because both of those only needed minimal attention to level, at least with his intelligence, he could do so while walking. With a look of concentration, he began to weave his mana around his body. Last rank up, he had discovered the differences between his own mana and external mana. He had used the mana gathering rune that he had found to collect mana in an effort to create some sort of projectile skill. He had succeeded, but had also found out more about the nature of mana in the process. It was a substance that could be found anywhere, but was far from homogeneous. Every living being changed the mana within them as they processed it, to the point where even mana that had been cycled enough would be slightly different. People could still use that mana, but it would allow for different applications. Jonathan had used it to act as a projectile charge, as the foreign mana was a lot easier to expel. Now that he had gone beyond that stage, however, he needed to find some more insights on the matter. As he walked, he kept part of his attention on the path, and part of it on his swirling core. Edgar seemed to be doing something similar with his elemental energy as he floated through the air. The man had become increasingly fond of flying everywhere that he went now that he was tier 2. He had not reached the point of a true flight skill yet, but he was getting close. He was keeping up with Jonathan after all. Jonathan sighed, letting the distraction fade away. Instead, he focused most of his attention on the problem of his mana. Obviously, it wasn't like he could rank up in a few hours. Getting to the next rank would take months even if he studied every day. He would have more time after beating Granath, but for now, he needed to level up as a top priority. As his mana percolated within him, he kept an eye out for any monsters. The nearest city was a good way away, and it was barely visible, even with his enhanced eyesight. At his current level, he could see hundreds of miles if the skies were clear, and could make out bacteria and microbes if he tried hard enough. However, those abilities were usually uncalled for, and he had been given little reason to use them. Maybe one day he would encounter a monster that was smaller than a grain of sand, but for now, unless he took up crafting, he did not see much of a reason for it. His current path was good enough for him. As he started to get a hold over his mana, using his intelligence to categorize the ways in which his own mana and that of the outside world differed, he was able to create a chart that plotted his progress over time. As his mana manipulation skills had increased, so had the overall density of his mana. It had been a gradual process, but he was sure that a single point of mana now was greater than a single point had been when he had first come to this world. It was a result of his levels, as well as from his exploits in the field of mana compression. In any case, it meant that his magical abilities were even stronger than they should have been. The method in which this worked was not clear enough to him as of now, but he was satisfied with how far he had come. He did not need to know every last minutiae of how his powers worked to know that they did. As he explored his talents in this area, he began to get a better understanding of how much it had increased.